What if Earth was designed by the lawful becoming of matter and memory, erosion and return? We accept the beauty without forcing a maker, and still feel held by pattern. In that soft middle, we find a home for wonder. And as the thought settles, we drift into the rock itself, into the pages beneath our feet, into the slow library where the planet keeps what it can and lets the rest dissolve. We move through stone the way a dream moves through a room, weightless but attentive, carried by the feeling that meaning might be less a secret message and more a rhythm that repeats until it feels like a hand on the shoulder. We pass through strata like seasons, noticing how the colors change, how iron learns to rust into the language of red, how carbon whispers its long arithmetic through the quiet arrangements of shells, turned to limestone, turned to mountains, and then back to sand. Time doesn't hurry here, it sifts. It doesn't argue, it waits. If there is a blueprint, it isn't a plan we could hold, but a set of tendencies cooling and cracking, settling and lifting, dissolving and precipitating, that turn chaos into familiar forms, not because someone wanted it so, but because energy seeks easier paths, the way water finds the lowest fold. We consider fossils with the same patience the earth gave them, their bones traded for minerals, their outlines turning from animal to artifact, from breath to stone, and even then, still telling us something we didn't know how to hear before we learned to read isotopes, as if they were dates etched in light. Oxygen ratios lean one way, then the other, and we see ice grow like a slow thought, then melt like a long-held tension finally exhaled. Carbon climbs, and the air remembers fires we did and did not set. Lead clocks inside zircons tick so steadily that even entropy seems respectful at the edges of their calm. Could it be that memory is not a miracle but a habit of matter, the way crystals repeat themselves into faithfulness, the way sediment stacks until it becomes truth? We follow subduction zones where oceans fold under continents, where old seabeds descend into heat and pressure and return as volcanic stories, rewritten in magma and ash, returning minerals and gases to the sky like a rehearsal of breath, again and again, as if forgetting is only the other side of remembering. The planet erases to preserve, it breaks to build, not because perfection calls for sacrifice, but because renewal needs space, needs emptiness, needs the gentle undoing of what has overstayed its shape. In this we feel the law of becoming, austere and generous, indifferent to our meanings, and yet somehow generous enough to host them. We sense climate's pendulum, oceans storing warmth like a secret, ice keeping its pale diaries sealed in bubbles until someone listens, dunes moving as if guided by unseen metronomes. Maybe it all feels designed because repetition comforts us. Maybe it feels intentional because symmetry is the one language our minds accept without suspicion. Or maybe, just maybe, laws, when stretched across billions of years, behave like intention behaves across a single day, consistent, quiet, faithful to their character. And what of us, small and brief, leaving glassy sands and alloy pebbles and rare isotopes stitched into a bright, thin line? If the earth reads us at all, it will read us as pattern and disturbance, as a question mark laid over an old paragraph, not because we meant to ask it, but because our changes pulled the sentence into a new tense. We listen for an answer in the low frequencies of basalt cooling, in the soft code of clay, remembering water, in the echo of reefs regrowing over graveyards of reefs. Is it possible that intention is what arises when many lawful choices are made, moment after moment, until the result feels like a path, and a path feels like a purpose? Is it possible that purpose is only what a path sounds like from the inside? The light fades over a plain that used to be a sea, and the wind writes on the surface what the tides once wrote below. Even the air has a memory of salt. We rest with that thought, not to solve it, but to share its weight, to let it steady our breathing. And yet, if the law of becoming leaves such careful traces, if patterns return so gently after every erasure, what happens in the long hush between endings and beginnings, in the quiet after the page is turned, but before the next line appears? We wait in that long hush, the soft interval, after an ending, and before a beginning, like the pause in a breath, when the body forgets it is breathing, and simply is. And in that quiet we notice how the world holds stillness without stopping, how even in rest there is a drift of dust across a windowsill of stone, a small migration you could only see if you watched for a century, or 1,000, or the length of a glacial dream. We think of patterns that persist not because anyone insists they should, but because energy finds comfort in certain routes, the way water finds the familiar bend, the way dunes ripple into the same slow handwriting, the way basalt cools into hexagons that look like a decision practiced for a very long time. Maybe repetition is only matter recognizing itself. Maybe recurrence is how the earth rehearses survival. Maybe the cycles of climate are not a clock we can wind or stop, but the relaxed swing of a pendulum made of tilt and orbit and ocean. We step softly between seasons trapped in ice, reading bubbles like notes in a patient song, seeing how air once carried less carbon and then more, how volcanoes exhaled and forests inhaled, how fires wrote their brief red marks and then vanished into blackened rings inside growing trees, not because memory is romantic, but because chemistry is careful and records what passes through it. Could it be that the pattern is not only what returns, but what refuses to stay gone, like shorelines imprinted on continental shelves, like ancient reefs now lifted into mountains, like the way life finds light at vents and in caves, in deserts and beneath meters of ice, repeating the simple truth that metabolism can be different and still be life? We listen for the metronome of tectonic plates in the low groan of subduction zones, where oceans are folded into the mantle, like pages set aside for later, and later arrives as volcanoes scribbling on the skyline, turning old seafloor basalt into sky rust, returning minerals to rain, returning stories to weather. And we wonder if design is nothing more than this habit of returning, this gentle insistence that forms will reappear when conditions come back around, not because fate commands it, but because physics leans that way. And if we trace the isotope trails, oxygen ratios telling of cold centuries and sudden thaws, carbon signatures rising with each breath of industry and waning with forests that return, we begin to see that patterns are not perfect loops. They are spirals, almost repeating but never the same, like a shell adding new chambers that mirror the old, while facing a slightly different sea. Maybe the comfort of pattern is that it gives us a mirror that doesn't accuse, a shape we recognize even when it contains loss. Maybe the danger is thinking that pattern is promise, when it is only probability, generous but not guaranteed. We look at extinction shadows, those quiet curtains that fell 5 times and more, and yet complexity rebuilt itself, not because life is stubborn, though it is, but because niches reopen like windows after a storm and sunlight slips in, and the film begins again with different actors, familiar lines rewritten by chance and constraint, the same rhythm in a new key. Is it possible that intention is only how persistence feels from inside the flow? That purpose is a word for the way structure keeps appearing, where energy can escape, that the planet's long breath makes design out of patience, not because an author stands behind it, but because the language of matter carries only so many verbs, and it conjugates them beautifully when given time. We drift with that thought over a plain of old lava now softened into soil, over a river teaching stones to be round, over a salt flat that remembers oceans as taste rather than shape, and we relax into the idea that patterns are not commands, they are invitations, and the earth accepts again and again at scales too large for a single lifetime, too gentle for a single storm. And yet, if the pattern keeps returning with such quiet strength, if cycles lean toward the same forms while never fully repeating, could there be a blueprint that breathes, a design that edits itself as it goes, not fixed, not rigid, but alive enough to change its mind when the world does? If there could be a blueprint that breathes, then maybe it begins where breath begins, in dust, in grains, so small they move like thoughts, lifted by winds that do not hurry, settling in places that do not expect them. Deserts feeding oceans with quiet generosity, volcanoes grinding their own bones into ash that becomes a meal for the sea. And we watch how the finest pieces remember the largest stories, not because they intend to, but because dust is what remains when time has written long, and erosion has read every line. We lean close to the microscopic, to pollen caught in lakebed mud, to ash layers that mark forgotten winters, to cosmic dust drifting through the atmosphere and seeding clouds, and we feel how a planet writes in powder when the chisel is too loud, how silt carries phosphorus downriver the way a whisper carries news through a sleeping house, slow and sure, changing nothing and everything at once, because the smallest changes are the ones that last. We think of fossils as solid truths, heavy in the hand, but even fossils begin as dust, fragments of shells settling in warm shallows, plankton skeletons falling like pale snow, bones breaking, dissolving, reforming as minerals, until the ghost of a body becomes a new body of stone, not because life refuses to leave, but because chemistry is patient with memory, and finds a way to keep the outline when the voice is gone. Could it be that the blueprint is a field of tendencies, carried by dust motes, like seeds of form, where dunes migrate yet keep their repeating wave, where lows build soft hills that hold moisture like a remembered kindness, where ash in the stratosphere cools a summer into a thin-edged autumn, and the air forgets, and then remembers, and then forgets again? We notice isotope trails hidden in these powders, oxygen in ice cores, telling of ancient cold, carbon in peat whispering of forests that rose and fell, lead in feldspar clocking the age of zircon worlds inside a single grain, and we realize that dust is not just the end of things but the ledger of time, each particle a tally mark from an epoch that once thundered and now speaks only in the soft arithmetic of ratios, not because the past is shy, but because it knows we listen better when we are quiet. We follow the wind as it carries the Sahara across the Atlantic, a golden river that never touches water yet feeds it, feeding plankton that feed fish that feed us, and in that exchange we feel a design of consequences, a kindness produced by distance, a system so large that no single piece knows what it is doing, and yet everything benefits, almost as if intention does not live in any one place but arrives from the way everything leans toward everything else. Maybe dust is the planet's handwriting practice, repeating letters of landscape until the words form, basalt ground into soil that learns to hold roots, volcanic glass softened into clays that cradle water, iron filings becoming the taste of blood that animals carry as a private memory of mountains, and so the body remembers the earth the way a child remembers a lullaby. It was sung before it understood the words. We walk a dry lakebed where salt gleams like a quiet sky, crystals building themselves with such strict tenderness that symmetry feels like mercy, and we wonder if order is simply how atoms express relief when they finally find a place to rest, not because someone told them to be beautiful, but because low energy has a shape, and that shape pleases us because it is consistent, because our eyes trust rhythm where chaos tires us. In the long arc of deep time, dust is both traveler and archive, crossing borders, thickening soils, painting snow with a thin coat that makes it melt sooner, changing albedo, changing climate, changing the pace of seasons in ways most lives cannot feel, and still, the record is there, a thin film on ice that the future can read as easily as we read the soot line from a fire we do not remember lighting. Could the blueprint be this, a planet that builds by undoing, that constructs fertility from fracture, that makes tomorrow from yesterday's ruins, using the smallest pieces because they are the most flexible, because they slip through cracks and find their way into places too narrow for big plans? We imagine ocean subduction pulling entire slabs of dust-bound sediments down into heat and pressure, cooking them, pressing them, sending their elements back up in a different mood, a different mineral, a different story, and we see how even forgetting returns, transformed into something we can use, not because the earth shows mercy, but because cycles do what cycles do: close the loop, open another. And if dust is a manuscript, the wind keeps revising. If dunes are paragraphs that move yet stay readable, if ash lay thin blankets that the rain edits into lines, then maybe design is not foresight but follow-through, not a plan, but a promise kept by physics long after witnesses have left. We let this thought breathe in the fading light, that every grain is an argument against finality, an invitation to continuation, a small vote for life in the long assembly of matter, and we feel ourselves getting quieter, trusting that the smallest truths will hold, even when the large ones fall. And yet, if blueprints can be carried by dust, if the tiniest messengers write the widest maps, what else have we missed in the fine print of the planet? In the inks we cannot see, in the ratios that hint at a deeper script waiting under the surface of stone. If there is a deeper script waiting under the surface of stone, maybe time is the only hand steady enough to write it, the only architect patient enough to let whole mountains breathe, to let oceans step forward and then draw back as if considering what to say next. And we follow that thought into the chambers where time keeps its tools, decay that never hurries, heat that speaks in gradients, pressure that teaches minerals to hold their composure. We move with time the way water moves through pores in rock, slow and certain, noticing how isotopes count in their own language, how uranium softens toward lead, with a grace that could be mistaken for kindness, how potassium exhales argon, and in that small release a date is born, and it feels like a courtesy offered to the future, a reminder that memory can be physical, can be measured, can be trusted even when stories have blown away. We drift along a fault that is not a wound but a sentence break, a pause where one plate considers another, and the crust answers by lifting a range, by opening a rift, by letting magma translate the deep into a vocabulary we can see, black and glassy at first, then weathered into soils that learn to hold water and root and shade, not because time prefers life, but because time prefers change, and life is what change looks like when it learns to feed itself. We imagine an ocean sliding beneath a continent, basalt and sediments folding into heat, like pages pressed between warm palms, calcium and carbon rearranged into new minerals, water released into the mantle where it lowers the melting point, just enough to start a slow fire, a quiet engine that will someday write its lava into daylight. Could it be that subduction is not only a recycling but a rehearsing, a way the planet practices saying the same ideas more clearly with each cycle? Maybe not. Maybe entropy is the only editor here, undoing elaborate drafts until the simplest forms hold. And yet we find complexity returning after each geisha, reefs rebuilding on the bones of reefs, forests rising through charcoal, trilobites, replaced by ammonites, replaced by fish with bones that carry echoes of older plans, and we are left wondering whether the laws that dissolve also compose, whether the dissolution is the composition in another tense. We reach for fossils not as trophies but as teachers, feeling the grit around them tell of rivers that slowed and pooled, of deltas that fattened in quiet spells between storms, of floodplains that laid down thin pages year after year, until a leaf or a feather became a note left for us. And we read those notes in the carbon that lingers, in the iron that stains, in the sulfur that betrays the breath of bacteria, and we ask ourselves if memory might be what happens whenever a system prefers to keep a trace rather than start entirely over, not because the past insists, but because the present finds it useful. We look up into the cold memory of ice, where air is tucked away in tiny vaults, bubbles sealed with the care of a promise, and inside them ancient atmospheres wait like lullabies, the ratio of oxygen and nitrogen holding a temperature's mood, the presence of methane hinting at wetlands and permafrost, the soot lines recalling faraway fires and distant volcanoes, and we are reminded that the sky too has a history, that even breath can be archived if the world is quiet enough, and yet the sky is not always quiet. Volcanic ash can darken a season and scatter sunlight in a way that makes sunsets look tender, and in those colors we might mistake beauty for safety, but the air is honest, it records what it receives without judgment, and the record moves on with the wind, spreading thin, settling slow, folding into snowpacks and peat bogs, where patience is the only way to read. Could it be that design is nothing more than patience given a stage and enough materials to try again? The way hexagons appear in cooling lava, not because beauty is required, but because constraints are, the way river deltas fan into fractals, because gravity bargains with viscosity, and wins by degrees. We follow the thought back underground, into caverns where calcite grows from the breath of stone, drip by drip, composing a syllable that takes centuries to pronounce. Stalactites and stalagmites, leaning toward each other like relatives who will meet someday, if no one interrupts. And even here isotopes,
whisper lineage, oxygen telling the story of rain that fell warmer, then colder, then warmer again. And we see that time's engineering is not rigid, but responsive, a slow feedback with a talent for listening. Maybe time designs by asking the same question across different climates, and the earth answers with coral, or with fern, or with ammonite, always saying let's try this shape, let's try that rhythm, not because the planet thinks, but because matter in motion cannot help but explore the nearby possibilities, and exploration looks like intention when you watch for long enough. We settle into this humility, into the soft knowledge that perception is a short candle in a long cave, that our species learned to read the dimness only yesterday, and still, the patterns come forward to meet us, not loudly, but with the quiet confidence of things that have nothing to prove, offering their ratios and their rings, their grains and their ghosts, until even skepticism grows gentle, not because it gives up, but because it learns to hold doubt and wonder in the same hand. And if time is the architect, we might ask what blueprint it follows, or whether the blueprint arises as it builds, line by line, river by river, island by island, a feedback of forms discovering themselves. And if that is so, then the next question drifts in like fog over a cooled lava field. When stone records the direction of ancient magnetic fields, when iron remembers north from a time when north was elsewhere, what else does the planet remember in the minerals we have not yet learned to read? When stone remembers north from a time when north was elsewhere, we begin to trust that memory is not only for mines but for minerals, a quiet archive kept in the way iron aligns as lava cools, in the way tiny magnetic domains freeze like swallows coming to rest at dusk. And we sit with that, letting the idea grow soft around the edges the way basalt grows lichen, because this is how fossils begin too, not as trophies but as moments that didn't quite let go. We picture a vertebra settling into silt, the flesh returning to water, the bone trading itself, molecule by molecule, for calcite or silica, until the shape remains though the self has gone, and we touch the outline in our heads, and ask if identity can be this gentle, this patient, this willing to be rewritten while still holding its curve. Maybe the most faithful memories are the ones that don't insist on staying exactly the same, the ones that allow substitution and still retain a story, the way shell beds become limestone, the way leaf veins persist in coal, the way the color of iron can tell us how much oxygen was in the sea when the sediment fell, not because the past is stubborn, but because chemistry keeps receipts. We think about deep time, not as a number but as a feeling, a loosening of the clock, until centuries feel like slow breaths, and epochs like the turning of an enormous page. And in that light, the great extinctions don't flash like alarms, so much as curtains, long and heavy, drawn across a stage where new actors wait in the wings, proteins rearranging their lines in the dark, seeds biding time, in the soil's hush. And when the curtain lifts again, the play resumes with a different melody, a different set of bones, the same old hunger stitched to a new shape. Could it be that extinction is not only an ending but a kind of editing, not because loss is good, it is not, but because the system leans towards survival in any form it can find. And when niches open, life moves in like tide into a familiar bay. We follow the quiet accounting of isotopes, the way stargazers follow constellations, oxygen in ice, revealing the swing of climate, carbon in carbonates, tracking the balance of breath between ocean and air, nitrogen in sediments, whispering of ancient productivity. And we realize the earth left us a trail of ratios like crumbs, for anyone patient enough to test and test again. And maybe that patience is the closest thing we have to reverence that still tells the truth. Subduction takes the archive down, folding entire libraries of mudstone and shale into warmth and pressure. And yet even this descent writes something legible. Water released into the mantle, changing what melts. Carbon carried deep to return in CO2, volcanoes exhaling the memory of seafloor limestones, as if the planet were reading aloud from a book it once swallowed. Not because stories must survive, but because cycles have consequences, and consequences have signatures. We let entropy sit with us like an elder who speaks sparingly, reminding us that all arrangements drift toward ease, that castles collapse, that heat disperses, and still, in the eddies of that drift, order forms, crystals repeating themselves into prismatic calm, stromatolites, layering their patient domes, termite mounds ventilating, like lungs made of dust, and perhaps order is not a triumph over decay, but a local pause, a bloom in the flow, beautiful precisely because it is temporary. We think of atmospheric changes as moods that the sky remembers in color, in scattering, in ice halo and haze, volcanic aerosols cooling summers with a thin veil, industrial soot, darkening snow, and helping it melt, the air honest to a fault, absorbing what we release without judgment, keeping a long ledger in tree rings and peat, in coral bands and cave drips, and we ask ourselves whether the planet's memory is moral or merely meticulous. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe morality is our word for the feeling of responsibility when we realize we are now part of the ratios, part of the curves on graphs, that future hands will read in the same quiet rooms where we read the past today. In forgotten epochs, the continents wore different names and faces. Shallow seas laid down chalk from untold trillions of microscopic lives. Mountain belts rose and wore away like soft hymns, slow, repeating, gentle. And when we hold a piece of chalk, it is like holding a snowfall of skeletons, a condensed patience that once floated as light in water, and now writes words on a book. And this small strangeness reminds us that matter changes occupations without losing its dignity. So we move softly over a bedding plane where ripple marks have outlived the waves that made them, and we run a fingertip along the arrested gesture of a current, and we wonder if perception itself is a fossil, a trace left by attention on the surface of a life. Could it be that what we choose to notice becomes the layer the future can still touch, not because noticing changes the rock, but because it changes us, and we are part of the record now. Our bones, our soot, our glassy sands, our alloy pebbles, our altered isotopes, bright in the strata like punctuation we did not mean to add, and perhaps this admission makes our questions quieter and kinder. We breathe with the film of evening across a dry valley, hearing how silence is not empty but layered. Wind across sage, a hawk far off, the thin electric hush before stars speak, and in that quiet we let the chapter loosen like silt in a slow river, carrying forward into the next bend, a wandering that does not need to be solved to be faithful. If memory can live in stone and bone and air, if even iron aligns to a vanishing north, what happens in the spaces where nothing seems to keep a record, the gaps, the blanks, the nearly erased? What else have we lost that still shapes us from behind the veil of forgetting? If gaps and nearly erased places can still shape us, then erosion is the quiet hand that makes those gaps, a soft editor moving through stone with patience instead of force, writing curves where cliffs once stood and smoothing the world until it remembers how to breathe again. And we walk with it, with the hush of water over pebbles, with the grain by grain migration that looks like stillness, until a century passes, and the valley has learned a new sentence. We watch a river think its way around a bend, not because it chooses, but because gravity suggests and viscosity agrees. And this agreement writes meanders that widen, cut off, fade into oxbow scars, each loop a memory briefly held, and then let go. And the land wears these soft echoes like old jewelry tucked under grass. Wind does this too, tutoring dunes into ripples that march without feet, whispering sand from crest to lee, from lee to new crest, not because the desert is empty, but because it is unsentimental about keeping forms that no longer match the weather. And glaciers, those long blue auditors, tallying the mountain's details until only U-shaped truths remain, dropping erratics as punctuation where no grammar predicted them. A granite boulder on a field of chalk, like a thought that wandered in from another dream.
Maybe erosion is the planet's way of remembering what should stay, trimming the rest with a kindness that looks like loss from up close, but from far enough away is maintenance, like a careful gardener who knows that growth without pruning is only clutter. We kneel at a road cut where layered shale fractures along bedding planes so fine they almost sing when pried, and in the brittle pages we catch the outline of a leaf, delicate as a sigh. and we understand that even breakage can be generous when it reveals what it once concealed. But the same process, given more years, will carry the fossil into silt, and the silt into distant bays, and the bays into stone again. Cycles folding cycles, not because permanence is denied, but because the world believes in circulation more than display. Could it be that design, if it lives anywhere, lives in what returns after subtraction, in the forms that survive weather's rehearsal, the angle of repose holding its quiet law on talus slopes, the hexagon echoing in basalt columns and drying mud, the branching of rivers and roots and lightning repeating a shared solution to how flow finds its way? We follow the physics that underwrites these poetries, diffusion smoothing gradients, turbulence breaking currents into eddies that stitch energy into smaller and smaller threads, until heat eats the rest. Chemical weathering unfastening feldspar into clays that cradle water, carbonic acid teaching limestone to dream in caves, frost wedging, salt crystal growth, biological gnaw and burrow, all the little erosions that human eyes mistake for background, and which, given time, are the main act. And time, always time, making room by wearing edges down, giving seeds a crack to start in, giving lichens a foothold where bare rock once kept its silence. The quiet logic that says decay is not the enemy of form, but its oldest collaborator, wood to soil, bone to phosphate, shells to sand. The planet reloops its materials so thoroughly that waste is only a pause between uses. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we cling to this kindness, because it makes the losses feel like trades instead of thefts, and yet the data is plain in river loads measured in tons per day, in sediment plumes curling into deltas, in shorelines receding millimeter by patient millimeter, in the isotopic hints that mountains feed oceans and oceans build the next mountains, when their sediments are carried down a subduction trench and cooked into metamorphic visions that rise again, as schists and gneisses, their stripes a memory of pressure pressed into beauty. We step into a slot canyon carved by flash floods that do not come every year, or every decade, but arrive like remembered debts, swift and without apology, and the walls are smooth as if shaped by hands, red varnish pooling in hollows where iron and manganese told a slow story about water that stayed long enough to change its mind, and we run our fingers along a curve that once held the voice of a river, and now holds our breath instead. We think of entropy, the eventual loosening of all arrangements, and we notice how erosion uses that drift as tool rather than fate, guiding breakdown into useful transitions, boulders to cobbles to pebbles to sand to silt to clay, each size a different invitation to a different life, each particle a ticket to somewhere it could not have gone while it was still itself. And perhaps identity is larger than form, perhaps identity is participation in the flow. Is it possible that the planet prefers this soft logic, reduce sharpness, increase contact, spread nutrients, share minerals so that in the long view erosion reads as the circulation of generosity, not because rocks care, but because life has learned to read their disassembly as opportunity, rooted in the leftovers of peaks we cannot climb anymore? We stand in a rain that was once ocean, that was once ice, that was once vapor rising from a dark sea over a basalt plain, and the drops strike dust into motion, wake petrichor, draw lines down gullies that didn't exist yesterday, and the smell is a memory of microbes blooming, of soils breathing after a long-held note, and we realize that even the smallest weather writes fresh margins for tomorrow's story. If the quiet logic of erosion is an editor, then it is also a teacher, not because it preaches permanence, but because it shows gently and again how to let go of what no longer holds, how to be smaller and more useful, how to move without breaking the world. And we feel this lesson settling into us like silt into a curve of river where the current rests. And yet, if patience can change mountains and silence can move continents grain by grain, what other soft forces are shaping us while we sleep? What other near-invisible rhythms are arranging the ground beneath us into patterns we won't notice until we are already living inside them? If near invisible rhythms are arranging the ground beneath us, then perhaps the ink they use is hidden in ratios, in the way one oxygen whispers to another across a lattice, in the way carbon keeps two ledgers at once, one in air, one in stone, and we lean closer to hear the planets speak in isotopes, a language without vowels, soft enough to be missed by anyone in a hurry. We imagine drilling into ice that glows blue from centuries of compression, each bubble a tiny museum of breath, each layer a winter laid carefully over a summer, over another winter, and we read the tilt of the world in the proportion of heavy to light oxygen, finding cold encoded in the weight of atoms, finding warmth in a shift so slight, it feels like a sigh released after ages of held tension, not because the past is eager to confess, but because even silence accumulates texture with time, and in that texture we feel the planet's pulse. Glacier advances written as firm strokes, retreats as soft erasures, deserts breathing dust into oceans to feed invisible blooms that tint the air's chemistry and tug the climate's sleeve. We listen to carbon's double life, the quick cycle of leaves and lungs, the slow cycle of shells and limestone layers carried down by subduction and returned by volcanoes, like long letters from the deep, and we ask if design could be nothing more than this steady balancing, this exchange of breath between rock and sky, not deliberate, but dependable, not spoken, but understood by everything that lives under it. Maybe not. Maybe we prefer to call balance intention, because it comforts us to imagine a guiding hand, and yet the ratios remain even when no one names them, coiling quietly in corals, archiving drought in tree rings, Q-rings, revealing lost wetlands in the delicate signature of methane trapped in ice, and the story holds whether or not we are awake to hear it. We step into a limestone cave, where water writes with a patience we can barely imitate, drip by measured drip, building columns from dissolved mountains, and within the calcite we trace oxygen's fingerprints, warmer, then colder, then warmer again, a timeline of rain and dryness, woven into stone that once flowed through cloud and root and river, and we realize the map is not on the surface at all. It is tucked inside the minerals, like a lullaby hidden beneath the melody. We follow that lullaby down to the seafloor, where sediments fall like pale snow, microfossils stacking in quiet piles that will one day be uplifted into cliffs, their carbonate bodies carrying notes about the temperature of waters long gone, about the acidity of ancient seas, about the food that was plenty or scarce, and in those notes we hear the slow mood swings of the planet, the kind that do not shout but still change everything. Could it be that the memory we search for is not in any single layer, but in the way layers agree, in how ice remembers what the ocean knew, how stalagmites remember what the forest felt, how Los remembers where the wind has been, and how together they form a chorus more honest than any solo, not because the world intends to be legible, but because cause and effect leave matching footprints wherever they go. We hold a zircon crystal, ancient beyond any tree, beyond most mountains, its uranium ticking gently into lead, a clock small enough to lose in a palm, and old enough to anchor continents, and we understand that time carries both a razor and pen, that decay is not the enemy of record-keeping but its method, and if there is grace in geology it lives in this pairing, endings that measure themselves as they fade, beginnings that borrow those measures to find their place. We think of forgotten epochs as rooms the house still remembers by the light that spills under a door, the faint trace of an oxygen surge when plants learn to leaf the sky, the iron bands that tightened into rusted stripes when seas were different, the sudden line of iridium that arrived like a brief, bright signature from space and turned everything after into an aftermath. And yet, even after, life found new ratios to sing in, new chemistries to inhabit, as if the score were updated but not abandoned, not because resilience is inevitable, nothing is, but because possibility proliferates where energy can flow, and the earth is generous with pathways when given time. We watch the air change in slow motion, CO2 rising like an invisible tide, radiative balance shifting by fractions that become weather, weather becoming climate, climate becoming biography for every river and route,
and the isotopes keep their calm witness, lighter carbon hinting at fossil fuels burned, heavier carbon leaning toward old limestone turned to gas, oxygen in rain carrying the signature of a storm's origin like the accent of a traveler, and everywhere the ratios speak softly of choices made and choices inherited. Could it be that we are part of the ink now, our alloys and ashes entering the record with the same indifferent care the planet gives to fern and shell, that our techno-fossils will be read as a brief dialect, a layer fluent in glass and rare metals, legible long after our languages have gone quiet? Maybe that is the humility the numbers ask of us, not to be smaller, but to be steadier, to let our patterns fit the older patterns, to keep faith with cycles that cradle us. We drift then back to the surface of a calm lake at evening, the air cooling, the water layering itself into gentle gradients that will flip with the season and mix the depths with the light, and the thought comes softly that all these quiet inversions, winter to summer, deep to surface, rock to air and back, are the turnings by which a blueprint breathes. And yet, if the planet's ink is isotopes, and its pages are stone and ice, if the story can be read by anyone patient enough to listen for the smallest differences, what else might be written, not in chemistry, but in shape, in the recurring forms that bloom wherever matter moves, branching, hexagons, ripples, patterns that look like a grammar of becoming waiting for us to trace it with our hands? If patterns can be a grammar of becoming, then the pauses between them are a kind of punctuation too, and we slip into that quiet punctuation now, the long rests after endings, the hush between one rhythm and the next, where extinction lowers its soft curtain and the world begins again from a smaller breath, not because tragedy asks for applause, but because even absence has its own acoustics. We sit with the silence that follows impact winters and flood basalt summers, the years when light is thin, and leaves forget how to open, when oceans grow heavy and low oxygen zones spread like shadows under a door, and in that dim room the planet listens to itself, counting what remains, counting what can return, counting in isotope trails and ash lines, and the delicate arithmetic of plankton, that either bloom or do not. Maybe the silence between extinctions is not empty, but busy in a language we can't feel. Microbes rehearsing metabolisms in the dark, mineral surfaces exchanging ions like whispered plans, seeds waiting in soil that remembers rain as a story, not because hope is guaranteed, but because chemistry still has moves to try when life lies low. We trace the faint records of these intervals in ice that carries the taste of distant fires, in sediments that hold the slow rain of microfossils as a kind of lullaby, in the ratio of sulfur to strontium that hints at a world rearranging its breath. And we wonder if the pause has a purpose, or if purpose is only what a pause feels like when time is long and our nerves are tired. Could it be that recovery begins not with noise but with quiet, with a thinning of competition until lonely niches grow soft around the edges, and invitation sneaks back in? Could it be that extinction is the brutal editor, and silence is the patient copyist, copying the few phrases that still make sense into the margins where the next draft will grow? We think of entropy, how it loves the easy drift toward uniformity, toward warmth spreading, toward gradients flattened into truce, and yet in the lee of that drift small eddies persist. Hydrothermal vents throwing off steep differences life can climb, volcanic islands rising like unwanted footnotes that become whole chapters, fresh basalt weathering into clays that hold water and time, and the silence is the interval it takes for edges to soften into use, not because the world forgives, but because the world continues, and continuation is a kind of forgiveness worn by matter. We walk a limestone shelf that used to be a reef, and then a ruin, and now a shoreline where new corals set tiny anchors in the old skeletons of their elders, building upward into clearer water, as if memory were a scaffolding left for them by ghosts, and the water's chemistry tells of a long grief growing bearable, acidity easing as carbon sinks into stone, temperature nudging back from fever to warm, currents resuming their routes like postal workers after a storm. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the return is always partial, always crooked, always in a new key. and the silence between extinctions is musical, not because it carries a tune but because it restores the ear to the possibility of sound. We peer into black shales that formed when oceans forgot how to breathe, their carbon-rich layers pressed into pages by time, until they gleam like whispers, and within them trace metals speak in low concentrations about anoxic depths and sudden turnovers, about forgotten epochs where the bottom held its breath for centuries. And in this darkness we realize that silence can be lethal or tender, depending on what needs the quiet more, the dying system or the one that will come next. We kneel at a thin band of iridium, a bright exhale from space, and feel how quickly loud events become thin lines, how aftermath grows thicker than impact, how the years after the shout are where the script is rewritten by fern and fungus and small, urgent mammals, not because they are braver or better, but because in the hush their smallness fits the available light. Could it be that we misread silence as a lack of story when it is the workshop where stories are mended, that we treat gaps as failures to record when they are the record of a system choosing to erase what would confuse the next attempt? Could self-erasure be a feature of resilience, the way forests drop old branches to survive wind, the way rivers abandon meanders to move sediment where it's needed more? We think of subduction again, how entire eras slide into brackets of heat to be unbound and reissued as gases, as new minerals, as fresh crust, and the trench is a silence too, a place where pages disappear, not into oblivion, but into renewal. And the volcanoes that ring these abysses are not just ruptures, they are voices returning what the ocean learned while it was away. In the long dark between, isotopes keep their vigil, oxygen telling of cold and warmth, carbon of feast and famine, nitrogen of the ocean's pulse, and their calm is almost parental, a persistence that outlasts panic, calming our need for clear beginnings and endings by showing how much of life happens in the middle, in gradients, in transitions that look like quiet from far away. We slow our breathing to match the planet's longer rhythm, listening for reappearance, fern spikes in the pollen record after fires, pioneer lichens painting lava with the first rough grammar of green, calcareous plankton returning to lighten seas and brighten cliffs that will someday crumble into beaches, and we are struck again by how many recoveries begin with small, repeated acts that no one records in the moment, not because records don't matter, but because life is busy living. We feel the ethics that grows from this, not a loud command but a soft suggestion that we keep room for quiet, that we make time for intervals where nothing televised happens and everything crucial is prepared, that we learn to tell the difference between silence that suffocates and silence that shelters. And yet, if recovery germinates in hush and patterns return from the margins, what else waits in the quiet? What shapes are practicing in low light? Which forms are leaning toward the stage before the curtain lifts? And if we listen closer to the rhythm beneath the pause, could we hear the hidden metronome that sets the next movement in motion?
If there is a hidden metronome that sets the next movement in motion, perhaps it ticks in the sky and in the sea at once. A slow choreography between tilt and orbit, ice and cloud, a timing that does not hurry but keeps returning like a tide that knows its way home, and we listen for it in the small differences. The pale heaviness of oxygen in shells, the dust tucked into ice, the layered patience of sediments, counting years like rings, we can only feel when we close our eyes and slow down. We think of the earth leaning a little more, then a little less, its axis nodding like a drowsy head, over thousands of gentle winters and summers, not because the world is indecisive, but because gravity has a soft grip, and time enjoys variations on a theme. And as that nod changes the spread of sunlight, glaciers breathe in and out, deserts shift their borders, monsoons step forward and then back, and oceans store warmth in the deep, as if saving for a quieter season. Maybe the metronome is not one gear, but many, procession like a whispering finger, eccentricity, a long inhale and exhale of the orbit, obliquity, the angle of a question turned toward the sun, and together they draw the climate into cycles that feel like memory, not because someone remembers, but because the world keeps returning to familiar poses when the music calls for them. We peer into cores lifted from the seabed, each centimeter a small dusk that once fell on plankton drifting and settling, their tiny shells locking the temperature of a water mass into the ratio of oxygen they chose unknowingly. And when we measure those ratios, warm and cool flicker up the column like candlelight on a cave wall, and we see how ice ages were not walls, but waves, crest and trough, a rhythm that would be hard to notice from inside a single lifetime, but from here looks patient and precise. We walk along a raised beach, stranded above the current tide, a soft terrace the sea left behind, as it backed away from a warmer time, and we can almost hear the waves that used to think this was the edge of the world, and we follow that sound inland to moraines and kettle lakes, to erratics balanced on unfamiliar ground, and the pattern is legible even to a tired mind. The planet steps forward, the planet steps back, and each step leaves a print so faint that only a long gaze can find it. Could it be that design is what a rhythm looks like when stretched across stone? That purpose is how cycles feel when they begin to agree with one another, when ocean currents, winds and sunlight align for a while to write the same phrase across forests and reefs and ice. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe this is only our wish for coherence, and yet the records hold firm. Dust spikes in ice rising when the world grows dry and windy, pollen shifting as tree lines rise and fall, nitrogen in sediments rising with blooms, when nutrients surge and declining when the sea sleeps. A pageant of signals that enter and exit in time with the unseen baton. We linger with feedbacks that make the rhythm more than a simple clock, snow brightening into higher albedo, cooling the world so more snow can fall. Darker seas drinking sunlight, warming the surface until currents loosen and carry heat to places that forgot how to thaw, clouds thickening to shade and to hold, complicating the script with a softness that can warm by night and cool by day, and we breathe with that ambiguity as if it were weather in a room we share. We notice how these cycles carry the conditions of life like careful hands, openings for corridors where animals wander, seasons that let seeds press their advantage, long summers for reefs to grow high enough to meet the light, long winters for soils to hold a sleep that protects what would spend itself too fast. And even when the rhythm stumbles into extremes, the memory of balance seems to linger like muscle memory, a tendency to return not because it must, but because the pathways back are well worn. We consider the way continents leaning into different latitudes reorganize the song, the closing of an isthmus tightening a current, the opening of a seaway relaxing a wind, the uplift of a mountain chain, nudging rain toward one side and dryness toward the other, and the metronome shifts accordingly, not a dictator but a partner, adjusting tempo as the stage rearranges itself underfoot. Is it possible that what makes the world feel designed is this companionship between cause and response, this reciprocity where emissions alter radiation, radiation adjusts temperature, temperature moves ice, ice moves sea level redraws coasts, coasts move currents, currents share heat, and heat, always heat, writes the next line with a steady hand. We study isotope trails again, carbon in tree rings telling of a spring that came early or late, oxygen in cave formations marking monsoon strength, drip by slow drip, deuterium in polar ice, catching the breath of ancient storms that lost their anger over empty seas, and in each ratio we hear a soft ticking, not ominous, not soothing, just faithful, like the sound of a watch in a quiet room, where someone has fallen asleep, and someone else is keeping time. We drift into the thought that our own age has nudged the tempo, a fraction here, a fraction there, greenhouse gases thickening the blanket and shifting the rhythm faster than the old patterns can comfortably hold, and yet even so the metronome is not erased, only accompanied by a new percussion we do not yet know how to read, and the earth will record this layer the same way it recorded others, without scorn, without praise, with a steadiness that asks us to listen more, to talk less, to fit our feet to the floor before we try to dance again. We walk at dusk along the edge of a lake that remembers glaciers, the air cooling as a breeze moves downslope, a daily mimicry of larger cycles, and we sense the quiet power of repetition, not because it is dramatic, but because it is dependable, because it makes room for life to learn the beat and improvise without losing the melody, and our own breath finds the rhythm and calms to meet it. And yet, if the hidden metronome guides so much with so little force, if patterns reappear with only small encouragements from sunlight and shadow, what happens when shape itself begins to echo across scales, branching in river and lung, hexagons in basalt and beeswax, ripples in sand and stars? Could there be a grammar that is not time but form, a set of shapes the world turns to when it wants to say something clearly? If there could be a grammar that is not time but form, maybe it begins in water and ends in stone, a quiet alphabet of shapes that returns wherever energy meets resistance, branching when flow must divide, hexagons when cooling asks for fairness, ripples when movement brushes against a boundary, and we follow these sentences across the landscape, as if reading a book written by hands we cannot see but can still understand. We trace a river delta from the sky, its channels splitting and rejoining like thoughts, not because the water is indecisive, but because sediment negotiates with gravity and finds compromise in fingers that reach toward the sea. The same branching lives inside our chests, where bronchi divide to share oxygen, inside roots that explore soil for water, inside lightning that hurries down the easiest routes, and we notice how this shape does not care what it is made of, fluid, wood, electric fire, only that a flow must spread, only that efficiency has a look. We sit by a basalt cliff, where cooling lava hardened into columns, six-sided more often than not, sometimes 5, sometimes 7, but hexagons repeating like a soft promise, not because the rock loves order, but because shrinking evenly makes neighbors agree on equal space, and the same fairness appears in drying mud, in the crowded press of soap bubbles, even in a honeycomb made by bees who learned the cheapest way to store sweetness without ever meeting a mathematician. Could it be that form is a memory of stress relieved, a record of compromises reached by matter under pressure, a template carried forward because it solves problems in many places at once? Maybe, maybe not. And still we see dunes write wave-like lines across deserts and across the sea floor, crests slipping forward grain by grain, wind and current, leaving a signature that size and distance cannot disguise. We walk a beach at low tide and watch ripples in the sand echo the ripples in the shallows, fractal cousins born of the same conversation between push and pull. And when we look up at distant galaxies arranged in webs, it's not that sand is speaking to stars, but that the world prefers certain negotiations when faced with movement and space, and these negotiations rhyme. We enter a cave where calcite curtains hang in delicate folds, drips arriving like seconds in a slow room, and inside the crystals oxygen ratios keep weather in their memory, warmer and colder mapped into the thickness of layers we can't see without a careful cut, and still the shape gives away its history. Gravity tugging the flow into smooth drapery, the way time tugs stories into arcs. Above on a frozen lake, cracks radiate into dendritic limbs from a single point where stress began, a frost fern drawn by the physics of relief, and the pattern whispers the same lesson in a different accent. When a system has a choice, it often chooses to repeat success, not because it knows, but because it is bound. We consider fossils not just as bones but as shapes kept by chance and chemistry, spiraled ammonites repeating a logarithmic curve that fits growth without changing form, corals building lattices that turn flow into food, diatoms crafting glass houses with symmetry, so precise it feels like prayer, and these designs survive not because they were planned for us to admire, but because they allowed their makers to keep living long enough to copy themselves, and copying keeps the pattern when the body cannot. We let our gaze widen to the branching of rivers on a map, and the branching of veins on a leaf, to the way canyons cut into mesas making amphitheaters, where echoes learn to be echoes, to the polygonal patterns of permafrost, ground cracking into a net as ice expands and relaxes, and we understand that the grammar of becoming is not decorative but functional,
and yet its function carries a strange calm beauty that slows the heart to match the world. Is it possible that identity lives in these forms as much as in materials? That a reef is a reef because it grows in filigrees of shelter and shade regardless of which species are currently weaving it? That a forest is a forest because its vertical grammar lifts water and light into a layered conversation, even as individual trees come and go? That a coastline knows itself by its fractal conversation with waves, whether carved in granite or chalk? We breathe with that thought and picture erosion, as a gentle editor again, paring away noise until a shape declares itself, a meander returning to its wide curve, unless a flood insists otherwise, a talus slope settling into an angle that keeps its balance, and entropy, the ever-present eraser, still allows islands of order where energy flows through, because order here is not a final state, but a momentary agreement that lets the passage continue. We trace isotope trails within these forms, oxygen in shells mirroring the temperature of the sea where branching plankton lived and died, carbon in tree rings tracking years when ripples on a lake lingered into drought or broke early into flood, sulfur in cave crystals hinting at volcanic whispers that changed the way stalactites grew. And even the chemistry keeps to the grammar of cycles and curves, rising and falling in phrases that look like the shapes themselves. We imagine deep time as a slow copyist repeating successful letters across epochs, branching lungs in fish that will one day leave the water, branching rivers carving continents that will one day wear new names, hexagons in basalt cooled under ancient skies and hexagons in the quiet mud of a vanished lake. And the repetition is not a circle but a spiral, each return a little different, each rhyme new enough to keep us listening. Maybe this is why perception softens here, why awe arrives without noise, why identity feels less like a definition, and more like a cadence we recognize with our bodies before our minds, as if memory were housed in the comfort of recurring curves. And yet, if forms can carry memory and function through deep time, if grammar can exist without a writer, what happens when the planet assembles not just shapes but systems that behave like machines? Wetlands filtering, soils computing moisture, reefs self-healing. Could design be the name we give to resilience when landscapes begin to act with the quiet intelligence of things that keep working? If design is the name we give to resilience when landscapes keep working, then the crust is a library that lends and returns its books without ever closing, shelves that move on slow wheels, volumes lifted to light, and then filed back into heat, and we walk its aisles where continents slide like quiet carts, where mountains rise as if a hand had pressed up from below, where old seafloors come home in green serpentine and dark gabbro, not because intention pushes them, but because the planet circulates its memory, the way a body circulates blood. We follow a ridge along an ancient craton, a piece of earth that has survived most storms and mergers, its roots deep as patience, diamonds sleeping in the keel like thoughts compressed by time, and around this hard inheritance younger terrains are sutured on, volcanic arcs, folded belts, sandstones turned to quartzite, each bound at seams that read like stitches, and the seams themselves carry fossils of oceans long gone, trilobites traded into stone, shells pressed into a limestone that now sits in dry light, far from the sound of waves. And in this arrangement we feel order without an author, cataloguing done by pressure and motion, by the easy logic that keeps what is durable and rewrites what is not. Maybe the planet's memory is most visible where it resists forgetting. Ophiolite slabs hoisted from the deep, their pillow lavas and sheeted dikes, a page from the seafloor pinned open by uplift, evaporites gleaming in the heart of mountains, proof that desert basins once lay here, dry as a held breath, coal seams black and quiet, syllables of swamps and ferns that slept through eons until a pick opened them to air, and all of it arranged in stacks that are not random. The oldest at the bottom unless a fold has turned the story on its head, unless a thrust has slid a chapter over another, unless subduction has eaten the page and returned it as ash to fall in soft grey sentences over land and sea. We think of ocean subduction as the spine of this library, the place where returns are processed, slabs bowed down into warmth, sediments and their dead hauled with them. Water peeled away to oil the melting, carbon carried deep and released as volcanic breath, and the arcs above ring the world like lamps around a reading room, each eruption a brief light that writes a thin layer we can later find and date with quiet confidence, pairing ash to isotope to time, the way a reader pairs title to author, to find a familiar voice. Could it be that the library's system is simple enough to be beautiful? Density and heat deciding what sinks and what rises, radioisotopes measuring the weights, minerals acting as memory sticks that store the conditions of their birth in lattice and inclusion, so that a garnet can carry pressure, a zircon can carry age, a carbonate can carry the temperature of an ancient sea, not because minerals care, but because their structures cannot help telling the truth, they were built in. We run a hand across an unconformity, a surface where millions of years are missing, shaved away, a neat line that says the library moved locations while the book was out. And the absence is as informative as the pages we still have, an elegant silence that tells of erosion faster than deposition, of mountains worn to stubs, and then drowned by a patient sea that began again with the finest silt. Maybe memory survives as much in what it chooses to omit, in the gaps where we learn to read between layers, to feel the weight of what isn't there. In a canyon wall the colors step down through forgotten climates, iron painting reds where oxygen was plentiful, greens where waters were reducing, pale bands where carbonates precipitated from clear, warm shallows, and darker shales where quiet anoxic depths gathered the soft rain of bodies, and each tint is a catalogue entry, a note in the margin about weather and water, about the tilt of continents and the breath of the sky. And we understand why geologists speak of formations as if they were old friends. The library is not only facts, it is company, it is continuity, it is a room we can walk into and find ourselves calmer for the order we did not create. Maybe not. Maybe we read comfort into stacks because we long for coherence, and yet the evidence stands even when our moods do not. Valves counting years in glacial lakes, thin as eyelashes, turbidites recording submarine avalanches in graded beds that begin coarse and end fine, magnetic reversals captured in the iron of cooling lavas like a barcode, the planet prints for later scanning. And these quiet systems let us place events without argument, to say what came before and after, to describe a world we did not see with a confidence earned by consistency. We visit a mountain pass where limestones sit atop volcanics, and volcanics atop metamorphics, and metamorphics above a core of old granite, and the whole stack has been folded into a gentle arch, so that the library has become a dome where windows are cut by rivers, and each window opens a different shelf, corals at one bend, ash at another, nice gleaming like layered smoke in a third, and the air tastes of pine and faraway salt. And we breathe a little slower because the sequence is legible, even if the words are difficult. Is it possible that identity lives in stratigraphy as much as in species? That a basin knows itself by the cadence of its deposits, that a shield knows itself by the simplicity of its ancient stability, that an origin is an epic, not because it is tall, but because it tells a long story of collision and rest, of pressure and release, of heat applied and then withdrawn, leaving texture like memory leaves tenderness. We sit by a road cut at evening, and the shadows climb the beds like an index finger following lines, and we imagine the future reader finding our layer, a horizon bright with techno-fossils, plastics turned to waxy rock, alloys smoothed into pebbles, soot tucked into ice that grew over a lake, then melted and left the story in mud, paired with an isotope pulse that says we moved carbon quickly, that we wrote in the margins with a bold hand, and the library will not judge, it will simply archive, folding our chapter into the larger book, with the same indifferent care it gives to chalk and shale, and ash. If the crust is a library, then librarianship is done by physics, by gravity and heat, by water and wind, by time and chance, and curation is accomplished through subduction and uplift, through deposition and erosion, and we are invited to read rather than to own, to handle the volumes gently, because the next reader will need them too, to borrow what we can understand and return what we cannot without damage. And yet, if the shelves can move and the books can be rewritten, if memory is both stacked and stirred, what happens when we turn our attention to the margins where shelves meet? Fault zones and rifts and sutures, those threshold places where the library speaks in a different voice, where the machinery of the planet shows through, and where intent, if it exists at all, would sound most like a system choosing its next chapter. If intent, if it exists at all, would sound most like a system choosing its next chapter, then we should listen where shelves meet, where plates decide on direction in the hush beneath earthquakes, where rifts open like careful zippers and sutures hold like healed bones, and we come quietly to these margins with the lights low, letting the ground speak in long pauses and rare syllables, because even a fault has a kind of breath. We stand at the edge of a transformed boundary, where two continents slide past like strangers sharing a narrow corridor, not because they disagree, but because the simplest path forward is sideways, and the rock records this compromise in slickened sides polished to a subtle gloss, in offset streams that remember being whole, in sag ponds that gather the sky after rain and save it for birds, and the patience of years between sudden motions feels like a lesson in how restraint can be a form of force. We move to a subduction trench in imagination, because the real ones are deep and dark, and we picture an ocean plate bowing down with a grace learned from gravity, sediments and fossils and salts packing their bags for pressure, water locked in minerals, slipping free at depth, and lowering the melting point like a kindness, and above, arcs of volcanoes set their lamps along the margin, each eruption a letter returned to the air, each ash fall a thin page we can trace with isotopes later, as if the planet left us receipts for what it borrowed.
Maybe these thresholds are where memory changes tense, present perfect slipping into past continuous old crust, written over into new compositions, blue schist and ecologite, wearing the colors of stress, metamorphic fabrics aligned like fur stroked in one direction by heat and time. And in these textures the story isn't told in words but in alignments, in mica that learned to lie flat under pressure, in garnets that grew like slow moons, and now hold the pressure they knew inside their rings, the way trees carry drought and flood as bands of dark and light. We visit a rift valley where a continent is learning to part without anger, lava arriving not as violence but as a dark whisper through low vents, basalt cooling into new floors that future seas might claim, and the flanks sink gently as shoulders relax, lakes collecting in the fresh space like thoughts that could not form until silence made room, and the air is thin with possibility. Forests along one side, salt flats on the other, fumaroles speaking quietly of gas the deep cannot keep, and we feel how a margin is a promise more than a boundary. Could it be that faults and sutures are the planet's sentences, that where they intersect we should expect commas and colons, pauses, lists, clarifications, rather than endings, and that earthquakes, when they do come, are not shouts but punctuation marks that wake us into reading more carefully? Maybe, maybe not. And yet every offset stratum, every folded bed, every breccia of broken stones re-cemented by mineral rain, tells us the script does not tear when it breaks. It edits, it splices, it rearranges. We kneel by a myelinite zone, where rock has been milled to silk under shear, quartz ribbons stretched until they hold a sheen, feldspar porphyroclasts, rotating like patient dancers frozen mid-turn. And even in this slow violence there is grace, the kind that leaves a map of strain we can follow with a fingertip, the kind that writes direction into texture so the memory will not be lost, even if names and dates are. We sit at dusk on an uplifted suture where two continents met and refused to part again, an ancient ocean crushed into a seam full of serpentinite slick as moss, and scattered there are pieces of the seafloor, a pillow lava here, a gabbro there, a Harzburgite from a mantle that once flowed, now sunlit and smelling faintly of iron and rain, and this improbable assembly feels like a museum built by accident, curated by pressure, catalogued by chance, and still it teaches, just by existing, that what was far can become near. that what was beneath can become our horizon. We think of isotope trails as faint ink running through these margins, strontium in carbonates, telling if the water was river-borne or ocean salted, lead in zircons fixing the age of cooling as if time shook hands and left a trace. Argon exhaled from feldspar marking when heat finally released its grip, and these measures let us place the motions into the longer breath of climate and sea level and life. So the fault is never just a line but a chapter with weather and creatures resting on its pages. We feel entropy press outward in everything, loosening structures toward ease, and yet at margins the planet invests energy into order, mountains standing, basins deepening, new crust built, and old crust folded, and this local defiance is not a rebellion but a relay, a way of moving heat outward, a way of cooling the core by writing topography on the skin, and resilience here looks like function, valleys that catch rain, deltas that filter rivers, ranges that make monsoons by asking air to climb and cool, a machine made of thresholds that keeps turning without a clock. Is it possible that memory itself prefers edges, that identities sharpen where contrasts meet, salt against fresh, hot against cold, high against low, so that species diversify near coasts and mountains, so that fossils are abundant where conditions flip between mud and sand, wet and dry, storm and calm, the record richest where the world couldn't decide, and therefore decided to keep both. We listen for the quiet within the drama, for the years of stillness between slips, for the long intervals when a fault is only a line humming in stone, birds nesting in fractures, roots finding moisture in open seams, and we think of loss and self-erasure, and how margins can hide what they create. The trench swallowing landscapes whole, the thrust tucking younger beds beneath older, the rift scattering signatures across a widening, until only ratios tell the truth, and we must believe numbers the way sailors believe stars. Maybe we are drawn to thresholds because we live in one, between what we remember and what we can prove, between a climate we inherited and a climate we are making, and the geology does not judge our uncertainty, it only hands us a long example of change that still lands in patterns we can learn to hold gently. Night lowers over the scarp, and the last light lays cross-bedded shadows on a tilted sandstone face, making the past visible in stripes that look like waves paused mid-sweep, and our breathing slows to match the earth's deeper patience, the kind that makes mountains without hurry and oceans without regret. And in that steadying quiet a small question rises like heat from a cooling flow. If margins are where the machinery shows through, if thresholds reveal systems that act like choices, what of the marks we leave, our glassy sands, our alloy pebbles, our altered air, will they become margins in the rock, a bright band of technofossils, a hinge the future opens to read who we were, and what we asked the planet to become? If our marks become margins in the rock, a bright band the future will open like a hinge, then the question grows softer and stranger. What if we are not the first hinge, not the first bright band? What if deep time has already closed and opened chapters we no longer know how to name, and we walk into that possibility with our lamps dimmed, so our eyes can adjust to the low light where old signals hide? We imagine how a civilization could pass and leave almost nothing, not because it lacked fire or thought, but because the planet is a tidy librarian, shelving, rebinding, reusing. 1,000,000 years is a long broom, 5,000,000 a long tide, and plastics become waxy stone, alloys become pebbles, cities become clay that looks like any other floodplain, after enough floods, and the record keeps only what fits the rules of preservation, burial, exclusion from air, a chemistry that favors staying over leaving, a habit of becoming mineral instead of memory. Could it be that an old industry could dissolve into isotopes and oddities, a spike in certain metals, a thin breath of soot in a layer too uniform to be volcanic, a brief rearrangement of carbon that looks like a fever in the air, followed by a lull, and would we notice? Or would we file it under weather and move on? Because most things are weather in the end. We hold the thought lightly and turn to the strictness of geology, letting it calm the imagination without closing it. The crust is restless, ocean floors are young, land is recycled more often than we expect, and a technology that does not choose stone as its dwelling is a technology that becomes wind, and wind is one of the great erasers, not because the world is cruel, but because ease is the preferred direction of things, entropy leaning on every structure until only the most stubborn connections remain. We think about technofossils, the way our layer will read, glass spheres fused from stormed power lines and foundries, concrete in strange geometries, plastic polymers cross-linked into long-lived wax rock, fly ash silted into estuaries, rare earths and platinum group elements distributed, as if a meteor had learned to be everywhere at once. And we let the estrangement settle. The future might not call these artifacts, it might call them faces, might index them as simply as we index chalk or till, and the humility of that is a gentle teacher. Maybe, maybe not, maybe there were others with a shorter pulse and a smaller footprint, whose cleverness lived mostly in wood and skin and story, whose cities were gardens that rotted beautifully, whose tools returned to soil like fallen leaves, leaving only arrangements of phosphorus and charcoal, too subtle to find under all the other arrangements of phosphorus and charcoal, the planet has made for itself. Is it possible that signs of intention dissolve fastest, while changes and cycles linger longest? That the true technofossil of any clever species is a shift in how carbon and oxygen dance, how nitrogen moves through air and rain, how sulfur comes and goes between rock and sky, and if so, then our best evidence for an ancestor would be a pattern we already read as climate, as ocean chemistry, as a boundary we thought was only volcanic or only impact. We turn to forgotten epochs that already feel like rumors. The great oxidation event when rust found the sea and the sky woke up to breath, the methane hazes that may have come and gone like veils, the sudden warmths and colds written into shells and ice, and we ask the impolite question gently, what if one of those swings had help, a nudge from minds we will never meet, a brief stanza inserted into the planet's long poem, not because conspiracy pleases us, it does not, but because the humility of deep time requires that we check even the strange drawers before closing them. We follow subduction as a quiet accomplice in forgetting, whole shelves of potential memory folded into heat, until they speak only as gases, only as altered minerals, who no longer remember the lines they once held, and yet not all is erased. Some seafloor is lifted into sunlight, some trenches preserve shreds of ocean in serpentinite that smells like rain and iron, some zircons survive the fire, and carry dates older than nearly everything else, and these survivors tell us how rare, how lucky, how conditional memory must be to last in stone. We visit the subtle evidence we can actually hold, spheroidal concretion that gathered metals around a nucleus like a thought around a worry, magnetic grains that freeze old norths into a rock's tiny faith, soot trapped in polar ice from fires that may have been lightning and may have been hands, and each is a maybe that nudges the imagination, but bows to the data, and this bowing is our discipline, our lullaby of rigor that keeps wonder from running wild in the dark. We consider the way humans read ourselves into patterns and how easy it would be to find cities in dunes and roads in riverbeds, to mistake geometry for design in places where physics prefers straight lines, and so we keep returning to ratios, and to the quiet arithmetic of decay, carbon that leans too light when forests are fed hydrocarbons, sulfur that leans toward petrogenic when rocks are burned, nitrogen that shifts its voice when soils are turned and turned again, and in these voices we hear our own echo already, loud to us, faint to the future, but measurable in the thin persistence of chemistry that does not forget as quickly as stone. Maybe the true question is not whether others were here, but whether we would recognize them without wanting to, whether we could hold proof that changes nothing about our duty to this layer we are writing, whether the planet's memory gives us permission to be temporary with grace, to accept that self-erasure is a kindness when it leaves the cycles quieter than we found them. We step out under a night where satellites scatter new constellations that no myth can hold, and we feel the sky growing crowded with our mirrors, and it occurs to us that even this will fall, burn and fold into the same thin band we cannot yet imagine reading, and we breathe easier, knowing that the library will shelve us with care, and without ceremony. What if the most generous design is the one that dissolves its builders into the fertility of what comes next?
What if the measure of wisdom is how little trouble our artifacts cause when they become sediment? What if the only legacy that lasts is a shift in the rhythm that helps life through a narrow passage instead of tightening it? The wind quiets over a dark plain where old lava has begun to green, and a small plant finds a crack and makes a choice so simple it looks like faith. And the planet, older than instruction and younger than regret, keeps writing in basalt and ash and rain, and somewhere in those pages, if there were others, they have become the grammar, not the words. And yet, if lost civilizations can hide inside cycles and chemistry, if intention can weather into ratios and still guide a recovery, what other messages might be carried forward without language at all? What signals in stone and bone could teach after their makers are gone? And are we brave enough to listen for them without insisting they sound like us? If signals could teach after their makers are gone, perhaps they are not voices at all, but behaviors, functions that keep working in the dark, wetlands that filter soils that compute moisture, reefs that self-heal one polyp at a time. And we ease into this thought, the way dusk eases into a valley, slow enough that everything keeps its shape, while the colors grow kinder. We picture a marsh at the river's mouth, not glamorous, not loud, a lace of channels and reeds sipping floodwater, until its anger is gone, settling silt grain by patient grain, catching nitrogen in the roots of bacteria, who never sleep, turning murk into clarity not because anyone asked, but because gradients invite solutions. And we feel how such places remember without remembering, a logic of flow that teaches itself every spring. We kneel to the skin of soil, that thin and generous boundary where minerals meet the breath of the world, and we feel how it decides, capillaries lifting water when the air is dry, pores closing when rain is plenty, clays swelling and shrinking to open passage or hold it shut, fungi threading messages from root to root like soft wires, a quiet computation that balances hunger and gift, not because the land thinks in sentences, but because feedbacks learn their own timing when left alone long enough. Maybe design is the name we give to this kind of steadiness, a resilience built from 1,000 reversible steps, each small enough to fail without catastrophe, each flexible enough to bend without breaking. And perhaps the wisdom of the planet is to build from many small permissions rather than a few grand rules. We drift outward to a reef, a city of limestone and light, where polyps borrow carbon from the sea and trade it for shelter, and fish weave their lives through corridors carved by chance and appetite. And in the brittle calm we hear a schedule kept by tides and temperature and wind, a choreography that holds even after storms, not because the structure is immortal, it is not, but because repair is written into the habit of the place, calcium ready, algae ready, larvae ready, the blueprint breathing in pulses that continue whether or not anyone watches. Could it be that the deepest messages are procedural rather than declarative? Do this when that happens, open when warm, close when cold, share when rich, wait when lean, and that these instructions survive because they are stored in cycles, not in monuments. Maybe, maybe not. And still the evidence sits under our feet and swims under our boats, a daily persistence that feels like intention because it fits so kindly with our needs. We follow rivers as they revise themselves, side channels opening when floods arrive, terraces stepping down as levels fall, oxbows filling into meadows that store spring in green slow motion, and the landscape acts like a memory palace that keeps the instructions in rooms we can walk through. Cut here when high, deposit there when low. Let the braided strands untangle and retangle until the valley becomes a library of options, ready for weather we cannot predict. We breathe with forests as they tune their edges, canopies thinning after drought, to let younger leaves climb, needles narrowing for wind, broadleaves widening for shade, and in each adjustment a code persists. Hedge risk, diversify form, use decay as income, treat loss as resource. And in this the planet shows a teacher's patience, repeating lessons until even stone learns to host moss, and moss learns to make soil, and soil learns to hold rain. We step toward entropy with respect, knowing it undoes without spite, and we notice how living systems borrow its current, to move waste downhill, to spread heat before it harms, to soften sharpness into habitat. Decay becomes choreography when guided by structure, bones becoming phosphate for seeds, fallen trunks becoming nurse logs, where roots find a damp memory of last year's storms, and the message is clear without words. Nothing ends without an invitation attached. We lean over a tidal flat that writes in ripples and wipes clean twice a day, a classroom that never grades, and watch birds read the mud for air holes, crabs read the light for safety, diatoms read the chemistry for bloom or rest, and the whole surface is a script updated in real time, a wet syntax that never pretends to permanence, and yet returns so faithfully that migratory maps are inherited as if they were inside the wing. Is it possible that what we call stewardship is simply learning to harmonize with these procedures, removing the frictions that jam them, easing water back into old corridors, giving fire room to move where it once kept forests honest, letting rivers touch their floodplains as a matter of duty rather than disaster, and trusting that functions know how to teach us if we are quiet enough to listen? We sit beneath a cliff where ancestral seas stack their days in limestone hymns, and we see gutters at the base where rain has assembled itself into threads, then rills, then a trickle neither loud nor small, and the rock keeps lending itself to the water's lesson. Carve gently, share downward, fill what you empty by moving it where it can be used, and the balance is so matter-of-fact that we relax into it the way a body relaxes into sleep. When the room is dim, and the air is kind, we hold a handful of dark soil that smells of rain and years, and we think of forgotten epochs, of prairies that learned to store drought as roots, of wetlands that learned the alphabet of flood, of reefs that learned to pause when the sea grew sour, and resume when the tide of acid rolled back. And in these long rehearsals we recognize a humility we could borrow, not because we are small, though we are, but because smallness is a strength. When the future is uncertain, we ask our looping questions again, softer now. What if resilience is the only form of design that time respects? What if identity is the feeling a place gets when its functions are intact? What if memory is a set of instructions written into flows and openings rather than names and dates, a manual stored in currents and clays and calcareous rooms? Maybe the message for us is simple enough to say, and hard enough to keep. Build like a wetland, repair like a reef, store like soil, migrate like a river, let decay pay the bills, and be patient enough for feedback to improve what you began too crudely. The night folds over the plain, and the air cools into a gentle clarity where sounds carry farther, a hint of water somewhere, a late bird, a soft rustle of a leaf becoming soil, and we drift with the sense that these quiet machines will go on teaching whether or not we learn. And yet, if landscapes can act like machines, and machines can behave like memory, how far could such memory reach? Could an entire planet remember itself through cycles and forms alone? And if it does, what does it remember us by? And where in that breathing blueprint does perception begin to feel like identity? If perception could begin to feel like identity, it might start with the way a landscape recognizes itself after change, the way a desert moves yet remains a desert, the way a reef rebuilds and still knows where to reach for light. And we lean into that thought as if leaning into a warm wind at dusk, letting it hold us without rushing, letting it slow our words until they match the pace of stone. We watch a dune field from above, the ridges migrating like soft animals, each grain a traveler, the whole body moving, and yet the pattern persists. Crests align to prevailing winds, slit faces falling at the same quiet angle of repose, and we ask if identity is not a fixed form but a rhythm, not a name but a habit, kept faithfully even as the pieces trade places. We go to a coastline where cliffs crumble into pebbles, and the pebbles become sand, and the sand finds bars and spits, and still the shore holds its character like a melody played on new instruments. A theme that returns after every storm, not because it cannot change, but because energy and material negotiate toward familiar solutions, and familiarity feels like self. Maybe identity is what remains when forgetting does its work, the distilled cadence left after erosion edit, the phrasing that persists because it solves problems elegantly, branching to spread, hexagons to share space, ripples to settle motion. And these solutions are so old, they seem to come from the planet itself, a personality formed by physics and time. We sit with fossils the way we sit with portraits, knowing they are not the people, not the animals, not the leaves, and yet they hold a likeness that survives substitution. Bone traded for calcite, tissue for silica, void for carbon film, and the outline is enough to make recognition cross the gap. Could it be that identity is this willingness to be known despite loss, this ability to transfer the self into a new material, while keeping the curve of a shell, the branching of a fern, the articulation of a limb that once moved through water? We listen to isotope trails, as if they were the signature in the corner of the painting. Oxygen leaning warm or cold, carbon leaning quick or slow, sulfur leaning towards sea or rock, and these subtleties fix a time and place so precisely that a world we did not see acquires presence, and presence is close to identity, close enough to rest a hand on, not because numbers make us feel, but because numbers let us find truth where memory cannot go. We watch forests after fire, black trunks like quiet notes on a stave, seeds waking under ash, nitrogen cycling faster, fungi bridging the breaks, and the forest returns not as a replica but as itself, a new arrangement playing the same music in a different key, and our breathing finds the tempo, slower now, steadier, as if we too remember how to begin again without pretending nothing happened. We think of entropy, how it loosens everything toward ease, and we notice that identity persists not against it, but within it, by letting go of details and keeping rules. How rivers forget the exact path, but keep the meanders grammar. How glaciers forget their edges, but keep the U-shaped truth. How soils forget their fallen leaves, but keep the quiet gift of humus that holds and gives, and maybe identity is the shape of giving that remains. We wander to a place where an ancient reef was lifted into a mountain, and then worn into a meadow, and limestone now feeds grasses that feed elk, that feed wolves, that feed soils, rich with the calcium of vanished corals, and the chain completes itself without ceremony, and somewhere in that continuity, a kind of self returns, not coral self, not grass self, but place self, a continuity of function that survives the swapping of characters, and we feel the tenderness of that, the way meaning can migrate through matter like a tide, leaving and returning by different routes. Is it possible that time, when stretched long enough, becomes a mirror, in which the planet recognizes its own gestures, subduction bowing old flaws into warmth, volcanism lifting new flaws into air, rain rehearsing its soft erasure, wind practicing its long fine brush strokes, and the repetition becomes personality, and the personality becomes comfort, not because Earth is a mind, but because pattern is a kind of companionship we can learn to trust.
We step into a cave where dripstone grows syllable by syllable, and we feel how the chamber remembers storms as faster music, drought as rests between notes, cold years as heavier lines, and the identity of the cave is this score written into calcite, a patience strong enough to hold weather in stone. We step back out and the sky is wide, its color a decision made by scattered light and identity. There is a spectrum, a physics of blue that repeats, because law repeats, and law repeating is kin to self-repeating. We turn our attention gently to us, to how a coastline shaped our words, how a mountain made our lungs, how a desert taught our eyes to read light and distance, and we see that identity is porous, that we are made of places that continue inside us long after we leave them, calcium from old seas in our bones, iron from old stars in our blood, and the planet's personality goes on speaking through our motions, the way we build branching networks to share information, the way our cities develop hexagonal efficiency or fail and rearrange, the way our stories ripple across cultures and fade like waves on sand, returning in patterns that feel predestined but are only familiar, because familiarity is a path worn by many feet. Could it be that perception is identity's instrument, tuned by the places we survive, so that what we notice becomes who we are, and who we are becomes what the landscape can notice through us? Our measurements turning to memory, our care turning to function, our restraint turning to resilience, and in this exchange a new layer of self forms, neither purely human nor purely stone, but a shared cadence that a future reader might recognize as the tenor of our time. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the safest truth is simpler. Identity is the persistence of useful form across decay, and the most useful forms are those that keep options open, that leave room for return, that treat loss as information. And this is why the planet seems designed when it is only faithful to its habits, and faithful habits feel like character in a world that outlives its witnesses. Night comes on with the scent of water and dust, petrichor teaching the air how to remember rain, and we rest in the thought that identity does not need to be defended, it only needs to be practiced, like a river practicing its bend, like a glacier practicing its slow hand, like a reef practicing its small repairs until the whole city breathes again. And yet, if place self and pattern self can endure through forgetting, if becoming can wear the same face across different bodies, what of the blanks, the intervals where the record thins and the story stutters? How does identity hold through silence? And what shape does remembering take when almost everything is gone? If almost everything is gone, remembering takes the shape of patience, the kind that lets a thin clue grow heavy in the hand, the kind that treats a blank page as a page still, waiting for light at an angle, and we lean into that patience the way a tide leans into shore, slow returning, without the need to arrive. We walk along an unconformity where millions of years have been shaved to a single line, a neat horizon that says more by what it refuses to keep, and we press a palm to the stone as if warmth could cross the gap, as if touch could borrow back the missing seasons. Maybe identity holds here by contour, by the way the lower beds tilt and the upper lie flat, a mismatch that remembers motion without saying when or who, an outline that survives like a face recognized in shadow. We follow the thinness into ice, where a windstorm forgot to snow and a year is compressed to a whisper between louder winters, and yet the ratios still speak. Oxygen leaning a little heavier when the air was cold, sulfate hinting at a far volcano that dimmed the sun, dust counting drought with more grains than comfort would allow. And the story threads itself through these slights, not because the past wants to be found, but because chemistry leaves fingerprints even when the hand is gone. We stand at a road cut where a fossil breaks off at the edge of the page, a half leaf, a partial rib, the curve of an ammonite that never makes a spiral, and we let the incompleteness be kind. We imagine the rest not as invention but as hospitality for what the rock could not hold, and our minds trace the likely continuation through what we know of shells and currents, of mud that settles and buries, of decay that edits quickly, unless silt arrives on time. And here in the stutter we practice humility, not because absence is sacred, but because it is honest. Could it be that silence is the scaffold on which memory hangs, that the blanks make the letters visible by contrast, that a canyon says river more clearly than a plain says anything at all? Maybe, maybe not. And still we feel how gaps concentrate attention, how a missing interval sharpens the edges of what remains until form emerges like a tide pool when the wave draws back. We think of subduction as a grand eraser, and also as a teacher, the way slabs bow into heat, taking with them logs of seafloor life, pelagic dust, a diary of shells, and then return not as words but as breath, CO2 in the sky, ash falling like grey punctuation on forests that will someday be coal, and the memory is transliterated across states of matter, rock to gas to soil, as if the planet refuses to throw away a narrative so long as the elements can still speak it in another tongue. We watch entropy soften sharp edges, wood to mulch, bones to phosphate, mountains to sand, and yet in that softening certain shapes refuse to go. Meanders in old floodplains now dry as paper, U-shaped valleys holding alpine memory in grass and shadow, ripple marks surviving in stone that used to be seabed, and identity passes through the silence by clinging to verbs instead of nouns, to curve, to branch, to settle, to rise. We peer into cave drips that paused for centuries and began again, each new layer sealing the quiet like a letter in wax, and the pause itself reads as drought in the oxygen it leaves behind. The break is a line we can measure, and the measurement is a kindness that lets us say something true about a time no eye survived, and we breathe easier knowing that even rests are part of the score. Is it possible that loss of history is not the end of meaning, but the start of interpretation, the place where we become careful, where we double-check isotopes against pollen, pollen against dust, dust against the magnetic North seared into lava that cooled under a sky we cannot picture, and in this triangulation the blank becomes a room with 3 doors, and a draft through all of them tells us which way the past likely went. We stand on a desert varnish panel, where manganese and iron have written a slow dark gloss over stone, and petroglyphs cut that gloss to reveal paler ages beneath, messages layered as absence and presence, and the dates blur because sunlight and rain lean differently year by year, and yet something still communicates across the blur, a hand, a bighorn, a spiral, and we recognize how perception itself fills silence with connection, carefully if we are wise, quickly if we are tired, and the discipline is to stay drowsy but alert, to let wonder slow enough to be accurate. We visit a black shale that swallowed light at the bottom of an anoxic sea, its carbon-rich pages tight with what was unbreathed, and fossils there are silhouettes more than sculptures, outlines more than bodies, but in their ranks we count rhythms, bloom, die, settle, bury, and the rhythm becomes identity when detail will not cooperate, as if the sea remembered itself by pulse when names would not last. We follow a ghost shoreline etched into a hillside, wave-cut notches stacked like quiet bleachers, and the lake that carved them is gone. The climate that fed it moved on, but elevation and spacing allow us to infer the wind, the time, the patience of waves, and inferences become bridges built from absence to presence, tested with numbers, weighted with error bars, and crossed with a soft step that knows it might have to turn back. We let the mind stray to what if, with the lights low and the instruments steady, what if a techno signature was thin enough to masquerade as weather, what if a culture chose clay, and vanished into riverbeds, we now read as ordinary, what if our own layer thins in places until it is only a tilt in carbon, a bias in nitrogen, a breath of metal dust, would identity hold through such quiet, and would we deserve to be recognized by those who come after as more than a brief disturbance? Maybe identity survives in practice, not proof, in how cycles resume after interruption, in how a forest remembers shade after flame, in how a river finds its channel again when the dam is silt and rumor, and perhaps remembering through silence is a skill we can share with the world by stepping back where our noise prevents the verbs from returning to their work. Night gathers in a basin that used to be sea, stars rising like slow embers, and the air tastes of salt that has not seen water in 100,000 years, and we rest in the knowledge that forgetting is not a failure in a system that knows how to begin again. Forgetting is the space where beginning learns its lines, and yet, if remembering can travel by outline and rhythm, if gaps can teach us where to listen, what happens when the outline itself is carried forward in the minerals? The planet's ink could stone keep not just dates but directions of old fields and flavors of ancient rain, and could those faint records be enough to hear the next echo waiting under basalt and bone? If stone can keep directions of old fields and flavors of ancient rain, then perhaps echoes are not only sounds but alignments, quiet agreements between past and present that let us lean in and hear without ears, and we begin there, with a basalt flow cooling under a sky that has forgotten its clouds, iron grains turning as the planet's magnet hums freezing their compass into the rock so that, millions of years later, we can hold a fragment and feel north from a time when north was elsewhere. We turn that fragment in our hand and think of how memory can be this simple, this physical, a lattice repeating itself into truth, not because intention chose it, but because atoms prefer order when the heat lifts, and the relief of settling writes a direction we can test, a signature that outlives names. It is like finding a note in a pocket we didn't know we wore, dated by decay, addressed to anyone patient enough to wait for the ink of isotopes to dry. We walk along a cliff of layered lava, each flow a page with its own magnetic sentence, normal, reversed, normal, polarity flipping like a slow breath. The core takes in molten sleep, and these reversals become an index we can match across oceans, stitching continents with invisible thread, and the seam speaks softly. This bed cooled when north was south, this bed cooled when north returned. Maybe the planet's heartbeat is written best in these flips, not because they plan anything, but because they are regular enough to map and irregular enough to surprise, like weather in a long friendship.
a rhythm that holds even as the details refuse to repeat. We dip our attention into the taste of rain stored in stone, oxygen ratios in cave drips and lake carbonates, telling whether clouds came warm from tropic seas or cold from polar decks, whether monsoons were generous or spare, and in those flavors we can hear a footstep of ancient seasons, the way a year walked through a valley we will never visit. At scales larger than memory, water becomes language, using isotopes instead of vowels, syllables measured with microscopes and patience, and yet the feeling is human, warmth hidden in the lightness of oxygen, chill hidden in its weight, a secret we can learn to read by candlelight. Could it be that echoes are most faithful when they are least like voices, when they are angles and ratios and directions stored in minerals, not because the planet wishes to speak, but because its habits are legible to anyone who waits, and the waiting is the hard part we must keep practicing, like a long note held over still water until the ripples admit the sky. We think of fossils again, not only as shapes, but as recordings of chemistry at the time of burial, shells taking in seawater that carried the temperature of their days, bones storing trace metals that tell of soils and dusts and diets, and this intimacy becomes an echo when we analyze, a faint pronunciation of a world that once flowed through these tissues. Even if the body is gone, the uptake remains, the way a house remembers the spices cooked in it long after the cooks have left. We follow subduction to where echoes are pressed into secrecy, slabs descending, hydroxyl groups releasing their water and changing melting points, carbonates breaking and recombining, gases rising through chimneys to inscribe their presence in basalts that carry the deep's accent. We can't hear this in air, but we can taste it in rocks, noble gas ratios hinting at reservoirs as old as the planet's first crust, whispers from a mantle that does not forget as easily as we do. Maybe not, maybe we are the ones teaching ourselves to hear pattern as voice, and yet the alignments keep aligning, even when we stop wanting them to. The same reversal line in distant lavas, the same rain signatures in stalagmites, far apart, but breathing the same monsoon, the same dust markers crossing hemispheres to feed blooms in seas that will one day become chalk, and when these distant records rhyme we are allowed to say yes, this happened, and yes it happened together. We stand in a field where a meteorite once scattered, tiny spherules fused by heat, raining down into clays that would be future pages, and the layer is just a hair, just a bright whisper of iridium that shouldn't be there. And across the world the same whisper appears in the same year written by different clocks, and echo becomes chorus, and chorus becomes boundary, and boundary becomes the hinge on which a world turns from one set of animals to another, from shadows with teeth to feathers that will learn to sing. We think of entropy again, how it softens all this into one honesty, and yet echoes persist, because alignment is cheap to keep once made, grains fixed in place, lattices holding their agreements until heat or water argues them apart, and so direction and flavor and trace can outlast the music that made them, and in that endurance we find a mercy. Our questions do not have to be loud to be answered, they only have to be well aimed. We kneel by a lake core, and watch layers pass under glass, spring light, diatomaceous and pale, summer richer, autumn dark, with sinking leaves, winter a thin quiet band, year upon year like breaths taken and released by someone asleep in a room where no one moves the chair. And the echo here is not a single note but a pulse we can count, a pulse that jumps where ash fell, or drought stayed, a pulse that falters and then resumes, reminding us that recovery is a tempo before it is a picture. Is it possible that the planet listens too, not with intention but with sensitivity? Shapes repeating when stress repeats, chemistries rebalancing when flux returns, organisms inheriting tolerances that make old rhythms easier to hear again, and that this mutual listening is what resilience feels like from inside, echoes that find their source again, after long detours, cycles that locate their centers in a climate that shifts a little left, a little right, never exactly the same, and yet recognizable in silhouette. We turn once more to our own thin band, to the altered airs and alloy sands that will one day sit as a brightness between darker books, and we wonder what echo we will leave beyond artifacts, a carbon lean in tree rings, a strontium drift in shells, a nitrogen tilt in soils, directions in tiny magnets of baked clays that mark fires we set when we learn to farm the wind. Maybe the most durable echo will not be our shapes, but our timing, the abruptness of our changes, the tempo we added to the old metronome, a staccato in a score that prefers legato. We breathe with that thought, until the room grows still, until even ideas sound like footsteps in snow, and we relax into the comfort that echoes are honest even when we are not, that rock and water keep a calm registry of events without praise or blame, and that this register is our best chance at remembering well enough to mend. And yet, if echoes can knit a chorus from shells and caves and lava, if direction and taste and trace can call across epochs to say we were here, and the air was like this, what other calibration do we need for wonder to be useful? How do we tune awe with humility? So the next question leads, softly, toward care. If awe needs calibration to become care, then perhaps humility is the instrument, a quiet scale we tune against stone and ice and patient water, and we begin by letting the world set the tempo, by letting data speak first and longer than our feelings, because reverence that listens tends to be right more often than reverence that rushes. We sit with numbers the way one sits with a tide chart, not expecting drama, just trusting the rhythm to reveal itself. Oxygen in ice cores rising and falling with breathy precision, carbon leaning heavier or lighter with the sway of forests and fires, deuterium lifting a finger when warm seas feed clouds that bring the soft rain farther inland than we remember, and the record lowers our voice without dimming our wonder, not because certainty is beautiful, but because uncertainty held gently is. We hold a zircon, as old as the first quiet crust, and let its uranium tick toward lead like a metronome. No hand can stop, and in its certainty we find a boundary for imagination, a frame that keeps our questions from floating away, a kindly edge that tells the story where to begin. Could it be that awe is most useful when it knows its edges, when it says maybe, and then tests the maybe against what does not care, what we prefer? We watch a river coil around a bend where a town once insisted on straightness, and the river returns with patient curves until the town learns to move its fences to the language of water, and our breath loosens, because this is how calibration feels in practice, not a scolding but a lesson in fit floodplains allowed to be plains that flood levees set back to give energy a place to spend itself without spending us. We stand at a marsh restored to the mouth of a tired river, and see nitrogen drop as reeds and bacteria take up the work they evolved to love. See sediment settle into beds that will become soil and solace, and the difference is measurable. Fewer algal blooms downstream, clearer water for shellfish to build their chalky rooms, small fish returning in schools that look like mercy, and we understand that awe can be counted when it is given back to function, that gratitude wears waders and keeps notebooks. Maybe calibration is simply making our curiosity useful to the next storm, planting forests where slope and rain conspire to fail, letting beavers engineer with their teeth, listening to old fire regimes that kept fuel at a kindness, opening culverts to let salmon return to a memory waiting upstream. Maybe, maybe not, and still the evidence is plain where we try. Temperatures in shaded streams ease soils hold, peaks shed a little less, valleys green a little more, and astonishment becomes a practice instead of a hobby. We follow subduction's lesson into policy, slow and cyclical, building feedbacks that prefer stability, restoring dunes that choose their own shape against the sea, withdrawing from shorelines that pretend to be forever, treating coasts as corridors where storms can walk without breaking our homes. And it feels like we are becoming smaller, but the numbers quietly insist we are becoming wiser. The cost curves soften, the repair bills thin, the isotopes of carbon bend toward calmer air. When forests are given edges they can keep, we think of entropy again, how it loosens arrangements that are too tight, and we take the hint, loosening our grip on rivers, so they can braid and breed, loosening our schedules so migration can flow without fences, loosening our appetite for extraction that turns mountains into inventory. And in this slack we feel space for life to arrange itself as it knows how, the way lichens write soil on bare rock, the way reefs heal by step when acidity relaxes even a little, the way prairies rebuild their deep grammar. when fire is a companion, not a catastrophe? Is it possible that humility is a scientific instrument too, that it sharpens perception by removing noise we add, that it lengthens our patience long enough for signal to emerge, strong enough to hold doubt until numbers tip, soft enough to release an idea when the ratios disagree? And in this posture all stops being a fog, and becomes a lens we can hand to anyone. We open a core of lake mud, and count thin years and thick, ash-grey weeks and pollen-bright summers, and our fingers learn to read what eyes could miss. And the practice of reading teaches the practice of restraint, not because restraint is saintly, but because prediction improves when appetite listens to record. And every tree ring we match to a drought is an invitation to plant for shade and for flood both, to store for lean seasons as if we believed history, to follow the grammar of becoming with a grammar of care. We sit with forgotten epochs that returned from silence as numbers on graphs, sudden thaws and sudden freezes etched in calcium and oxygen, and the graphs do not frighten us when we hold them beside places that remembered what to do, wetlands absorbing storm pulse, mangroves catching waves, terraces stepping rivers down from harm, and we feel how all, tuned by humility, chooses repairs that are small, and many over solutions that are heavy and few. The way life prefers networks to monuments, we attend to our techno-fossil layer with a gentle honesty, knowing it will be read as we read chalk and shale, and calibration asks us to tilt our changes toward ease of forgetting, materials that rot without insult, designs that fail into soil, cities that retreat with grace rather than shatter into shards that linger, not because we despise legacy, but because we want the next reader to find function, not friction, when they open our page. Could it be that the kindest wonder is repeatable, teachable, peer-reviewable, an awe that endures scrutiny and becomes instruction, that welcomes correction the way deltas welcome fresh channels, that treats error as sediment to be moved where it can do good? Maybe the planet has been running this protocol for eons, and we are late, but welcome students. Dusk drifts in over a valley, where rivers meet at a braided mouth, and the light lays long on bars of sand that were water this morning, and will be water again by midnight, and everything seems to breathe in time with everything else, the wind with the grass, the current with our pulse, and the calibration completes itself in our bodies without a speech. Smaller steps, slower claims, longer plans, kinder margins. And yet, if humility can make wonder useful, and data can make reverence precise, what does the map of patterns ask of us next? Where do the forms repeat across scales, in a way that suggests a deeper grammar we could partner with? And how do we read that map without mistaking beauty for destiny? If there is a deeper grammar we could partner with, perhaps it appears wherever forms repeat across scales, a quiet cartography of branching and waves, of hexagons and spirals, and layered echoes, and we begin by tracing these shapes with our fingertips on maps, on riverbanks, on the soft geometry of a shell found in dust, asking it to show us how matter prefers to move when left alone. We watch a watershed think in veins, tributaries joining with the same courtesy capillaries use, not because water is wise, but because resistance and slope and time negotiate a fair division of labor, and the delta at the mouth writes a fractal, so calm it could be mistaken for rest. Then we look up at a leaf that mapped the same problem to light, branching to share the sun without stealing it, and we feel the invitation: build like this, spread load, share flow, avoid single points that break. We kneel beside a column of basalt, where cooling wrote hexagons out of hunger for balance, edges agreeing to be equal, so strain could be small, and we see the same instinct in a drying player, where mud tiles itself into a tessellation of ease, and in a honeycomb, built by mouths that never knew the word optimal, and the map grows clearer. Pack gently, minimize perimeter, let neighbors settle into shapes that cost less to hold. We follow ripples that rhyme across scales, sand waves in a shallow stream, wind-scrolled dunes, even the interference patterns of light on water, each a record of movement flirting with boundary, and the lesson repeats like a lullaby. Let oscillations distribute energy. Don't damn the rhythm, unless the rhythm has room to move elsewhere. If you must interrupt, do so softly and in time. Could it be that this map is not prescriptive but permissive, a field of good answers rather than a single destiny? inviting us to ask what if a city flowed like a delta, streets branching to slow and spread, rather than speed and funnel? What if roofs tessellated like basalt to share heat lightly? What if farms stitched like ripples across contour, catching rain where it lands so rivers can be stories, not sewers? Maybe, maybe not. But the physics is patient and will show us the margins where we fit. We walk the terraces of an old river that stepped itself down over centuries, each bench a rest taken between floods, and we feel how memory in land is often layered, not linear, and how layered memory gives options. The same layering lives in reefs building upward as sea levels rise, in soils stacking seasons of leaf and root, until drought finds a pantry ready, and the map whispers, keep room for thickness, for redundancy, for more than one path back to balance. We listen to isotope trails as contour lines for time, oxygen marking warmth and cold, carbon speaking for leaves and limestone, nitrogen hinting at the ocean's appetite, and we notice how these curves align, where patterns align, monsoon stalagmites, agreeing with lake cores, marine shells nodding toward ice, and the concord makes a deep quiet in the mind, the kind that steadies hands before they draw, or tuned by humility, becomes a drafting tool rather than a flag.
We think of entropy as the blank space on the map, the white that warns us not to fight gradients head-on, and we watch how life leans with them instead, borrowing their fall to run tiny mills, bacteria at a vent, leaves downstream of a drop, wetlands sloped so slightly that time can do most of the work, and the lesson is clear without scolding. Design with gravity, with wind, with capillary rise, store with shade, with depth, with texture. We imagine coastlines as moving sentences, commas of dune and mangrove and marsh, setting the pace of waves, and we let the grammar teach us how to punctuate our presence, setbacks as ellipses that give storms room to breathe, living shorelines as semicolons that connect sea and land without forcing a full stop, and our own structures as parentheses that close gracefully when their reason passes. Is it possible that the patterns prefer company, that branching works best next to ripples, that hexagons like to live under flows that pulse, that layered memories grow in places where erosion edits gently? Could we read this companionship as instruction and place our choices where these friendships already want to happen? Corridors along rivers, culverts that behave like roots, roofs that gather dew for soils that know how to drink. We turn to forgotten epochs as waypoints, recalling when forests once grew near poles and crocodiles basked where ice now stands, when chalk seas made cliffs from the work of single cells, and we ask what repeats beneath the change, the grammar of light captured and stored, of carbon moved and settled, of heat carried and released, and we let that grammar guide the next line we write into the air, asking only that it be easy to erase if the sentence needs to be said another way. We place a palm on warm rock after sundown and feel the day leaving in a slow exhale, radiative cooling writing its nightly script on stone and skin and sky, and we wonder how many maps live in such ordinary transitions, breath to cloud to rain to river to sea to breath again, and we draw our plans to trace those loops, not to own them. Maybe the deepest caution on the map is simple: beauty is common, destiny is rare, and the safest path is to treat beauty as a clue, not a command, to test what pleases the eye against what pleases the ratios, to let data veto romance when they disagree, and to let romance resume when it serves the function that keeps a place whole. Night arrives like a careful editor, trimming color into tone, and we keep tracing with our fingertip the lines that repeat across scales until we can feel them even with eyes closed. Branch, ripple, hexagon, layer, and our breathing falls into step with these forms, small and regular, like waves over a sleeping shore. And yet, if the map points us toward a deeper grammar, if we learn to build where the planet already speaks, what does a machine made of valleys look like up close? How does a wetland teach water patience? How does soil think with pause? How does a reef repair after ruin? And what might we learn if we listen to those engines at the speed they choose? If machines made of valleys can teach, Then a wetland is our first classroom, a patient engine spreading water into slowness, asking a flood to sit and breathe, and we wade into its green arithmetic, where reeds lift oxygen like lanterns for muddy roots, where silt falls out of anger and rests as soil, where microbes trade nitrogen down to gentler forms, and nothing moves fast except dragonflies, stitching light to water, not because the marsh is kind, though it is, but because function here is a chorus of small agreements that turn force into food. We linger where the channel unwinds into lace, where speed becomes surface, where edges multiply until there is more edge than middle, and each edge is a workshop, algae frosting sunlight into sugar, detritus drifting into the mouths of nearly invisible lives, clays swelling to hold back the silver thread of salt, and in this labor the valley behaves like a filter built by time, a slow machine that gains power by losing urgency, and we feel our breathing fall into step with its patience. We move inland to soil, the second engine, dark and shy, its computation done in pores and crumbs, and we crouch to feel capillary rise, climb into a root like a memory, climbing back into a body, to hear the soft physics of metric tension deciding which way the water goes, and how quickly, to watch clay plates expand like old books opening in rain, making room for what must pass, then narrowing in drought to guard what remains, not because the ground thinks, but because feedback is a kind of thought, and ages have taught these aggregates, a timing that matches the weather they wear. Maybe soil calculates survival the way a river sums its bends, tiny decisions iterated, until the landscape holds steady under weather's long hand, and we see numbers in the structure, bulk density easing where earthworms tunnel like commuters who know the fastest slow route, carbon binding itself to minerals, where oxygen goes shy, nitrogen tucked into microbial safes that open only when the temperature is right, and the ledger is humble but exact, losses paid in small coins, so no single storm can bankrupt the field. We travel outward to a reef, engine of light and limestone, a city that eats tides and hands the leftovers to fish, and we float above its geometry, each polyp a mouth with a mason's skill, each day a course of stone laid thin and true, each night a whisper of repair in water thick with plans. Storms break the city, and the city knows how to knit, larvae feeling their way to stony edges, symbionts returning when the chemistry softens, calcium carbonate precipitating at a pace that feels like a heartbeat. If we slow down enough to become the water, could it be that repair is the definition of intelligence when design is made of place? That the smartest machines are those that remember their tolerances and move gently back inside them after shock, wetlands spreading the blow, soils storing the surge, reefs raising the ground where light is slipping away. Maybe, maybe not, and yet the evidence folds around us like warm water. Clearer rivers below marshes that were given back their floodplains, steadier crops on land where pores were left to think with air, fish returning to be counted where reefs caught a decade of breath and used it to thread themselves together again. We climb to a valley that collects storms as if hosting them, its slopes terraced by old hands whose names are gone, but whose contour wisdom remains, and we watch rain arrive and fail to hurry, every step a small dam, every wall a plea for gravity to slow down, and the noise of erosion is replaced by a language of trickle and hold, and the valley runs its engine on difference, drop to stillness, stillness to seepage, seepage to green, and function emerges like a face from steam. We remember that entropy is not our enemy, it is the gradient itself, the fall we can invite into useful work, and these engines are invitations more than machines, programs of slope and texture that persuade water to do what life needs done, that coax carbon to stay a little longer where roots can find it, that sweeten the pH until shell makers stop dissolving and start building, and nothing here resists the physics, it all flows with it, writing instructions in the shapes that make resistance unnecessary. We pause at a delta where the river rehearses its options, splitting and rejoining like a mind at ease, and the valley arranges an archive in silt, Thin years over thick, ash lines like careful bookmarks, pollen rising and falling with centuries of shade, and the engine's memory becomes instruction. Plant what held, retreat where the water has a history of returning, add roughness where the speed is unkind, open space where the pulse has nowhere to go, and each correction is minor, because the machine prefers small, reversible moves that can be tried and undone without a scar. Is it possible that machines made of valleys work because they know their scale, because they do not ask a dune to be a dam or a reef to be a wall, because they break the problem down into local questions, this bend, this tide, this pour, and solve them in parallel until the sum feels like mercy? We listen and the answer is a long low yes sung by frogs and reeds and wind that has learned to carry rain without tearing leaves. We go quiet with the awareness that fossilization is the memory of these engines in stone, marshes to coal, reefs to limestone, soils to paleosols that remember roots like faded signatures, and deep time hands us blueprints encoded as faces, as geochemistry, as the angle of a ripple caught and kept, and we begin to see that design advice has been waiting in the strata all along, unassuming, exact, asking only that we read slowly. We think of subduction, the planet's recycling plant, and how even engines are temporary, their parts carried under and reissued as gases and minerals for new machines, wetlands reborn, where coasts move, reefs seeded where light returns, soils grown again on ash that cooled into forgiveness, and there is no grief in this turnover, only a deep satisfaction that function can migrate through matter like a tide. We take our repeating questions out into the dark. What if all we need to build is already inscribed in forms that last longer than our plans? What if management is more listening than rule, more partnering than command? What if the most modern thing we can do is to let ancient machines run, to tune them where we've made static, to oil them with time? Night settles over a floodplain that was allowed to remember itself. Stars doubled in still water that was roaring last month. Frogs starting their soft machinery, and the sound is calm enough to carry us toward sleep, toward the next room in this house of engines we've been walking through. And yet, if valleys can be machines and their memories can teach, what would basalt say if we listened to its iron and oxygen and quiet fire? What instructions are stored in the rock that points north, in the ink of isotopes that never hurries, in the cooled decisions of a planet that writes with heat? If basalt could answer, it would not speak in sentences but in directions and pauses, in the slow cooling that turns motion into memory, and we would sit with a fresh flow at night when it still glows at the edges, hearing the soft glassy crack as skins form and thicken, as iron-bearing minerals align to the planet's quiet hum, and freeze that listening into stone, so that north is kept, not because rock intends to remember, but because heat departing leaves its last thought behind. We would run a fingertip over columnar joints, where the lava's shrinkage arranged fairness into hexagons, each crack negotiating with its neighbors, until stress could settle evenly, and the lesson would arrive without voice. Distribute strain, prefer symmetry when cooling, allow separation to be orderly, so that breaking becomes a kind of peace, and perhaps design is just the name we give to failure done well. We would walk the dark length of a ropey paho, its surface wrinkled like cooled breath, and learn how thin skins guide the hop beneath into toes, and lobes that flow with gravity's script, a choreography of ease that writes itself wherever slope and viscosity meet. And the ink is chemistry, silica content shaping the sentence, crystals growing as commas to slow the stream, bubbles as ellipses where gases chose to leave, and the whole paragraph ends in a quiet stop, where the air finally wins. Maybe basalt's first instruction is patience. Cool slowly enough and structure appears, cool too fast and memory shatters into glass that tells only of speed. And we think of human heat, our urgency, our fires, our haste, and wonder if the rock is asking us to lose heat with dignity, to let plans set in columns rather than shards, so they can hold the next layer without cutting it. We step into an ancient flow now weathered into soil, its blackness softened to red,
where iron met oxygen, and learned a new calm. And in that oxidation we see time's second lesson. Endings are beginnings in another grammar. Rust a gate, not a ruin. Clays born from feldspar, like careful listeners who know how to hold water, and roots taking that water as if the earth were reminding itself how to be green. We find pillow lavas lifted from old seafloor, their bulbous skins cooled in a cold embrace, glass rind thinning into crystalline hearts, and the pillows teach about shock and gentleness, quench at the edge to survive the plunge, keep a warm core that crystallizes later, let the outside protect the inside until the inside is ready to speak. And the patience of that sequence reads like mercy written in silica and magnesium. Could it be that basalt also remembers direction in more ways than magnetism, that it points to the deep with vesicles rising like lost prayers, to form a light with holes, telling of gases that escaped, of pressures that eased, of a pathway from mantle to morning air, and those holes once empty, invite life to anchor, lichens to begin their slow arithmetic of acids, moss to practice its first soft sentences of soil, and a biome arrives not because anyone planned it, but because stone kept enough space to be generous. We stand beneath a basalt cliff, where cooling joints form organ pipes, and wind plays them with a sound too low for microphones, and just right for ribs, and we hear or think we hear, the way deep time composes, repetition with slight variation, stacks of flows, flows of stacks, a choir of layers that can't know they will be read as rhythm, by eyes that left their clocks at home. And in this reading we let wonder be precise, measure the thickness, log the paleosols between, match the magnetic polarity to a global suite, and awe sharpens into a method we can trust. We touch a dike where magma once forced a sentence into older rock, a black page written straight through granite, and chilled margins there hold the handshake, crystals smaller at the edge where the meeting was brief, larger inside where heat lingered, and the story of intrusion becomes an instruction in consent and constraint, how bodies negotiate in tight spaces, how the deep asks to be accommodated, and the crust sometimes makes room. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we are the ones translating kindness into chemistry, but even if the chemistry holds isotopes of helium, whispering mantle sources, strontium, and neodymium sketching lineage, argon clocks telling when this fire met its night, and the clocks are calm, and calm is the tone in which basalt speaks. Nothing hurried, nothing hidden, everything stored in lattices that do not bluff. We follow a flow front into the sea of grass it birthed, basalt weathered to minerals that feed dark horizons, where roots can braid, and in the way fertility lingers we see how rock becomes policy, how materials shape what thrives, how landscapes inherit moods from magma's chemistry, more calcium and magnesium, less fuss, faster soils, quicker forests, sooner shade, and all of this becomes the biography of a valley that does not remember the lava, only the kindness it left behind. We watch a black sand beach pulse under waves, heavy grains rolling back slow, light grains taken farther, and the shoreline edits itself by density, the way a careful thought discards what won't serve the next sentence. And basalt's lesson in that rhythm is to sort by what's easy to move, to let the ocean do the bookkeeping, to let entropy assist rather than oppose. Spend gradient wisely, don't hold what wants to travel, keep what wants to stay. We climb to a plateau of flood basalts, a world once made of successive evenings of fire, flows upon flows, until distance was swallowed, and only thickness could measure the ambition. And yet even here the planet softened its voice with time, columns failing into talus, talus into soil, soil into grass and wind, and the shadow of a hawk, and the hawk is the only loudness left, a moving punctuation mark across a sentence that still holds. Is it possible that basalt's deepest instruction is simply to align grains with field, cracks with cooling, slopes with gravity, chemistry with climate, and that alignment is how matter says yes to its moment, not because yes is virtuous, but because yes is efficient, and efficiency, given long enough, becomes grace. We place our ear to a vesicle-rich rock, and hear nothing, of course, and still we swear the silence contains a recipe. Lose heat slowly, share stress fairly, leave room for arrivals, right direction into your body, so you won't forget where home was when the sky was different. Accept oxidation as a ceremony, and let your failures be easy to live with. Night gathers on the flow, as if it had always belonged here. Stars settling into old constellations that once had other names, and our breathing slows with the cooling stone, with the waning heat, with the relief that follows effort, and we feel ready to trust the next page, the next layer, the next morning. And yet, if rock can teach in this low voice, if columns and pillows and magnetic lines can carry memory forward without a single sound, what might time itself say about engineering? What does a feedback feel like from the inside? And how does patience shape a system that edits crisis into calm? If patience can shape a system that edits crisis into calm, it might feel like a feedback taking a long breath, a loop that does not rush to correct, but leans, waits, and leans again until the trouble forgets its sharpness. And we begin by listening to ice and light, negotiate seasons without a word. Snow brightens the world, brightness cools the air, cooling invites more snow, and the white grows until spring's angle breaks the spell, and the loop relaxes, not because anyone chose to relent, but because geometry finally said enough. We walk with heat as it moves oceanward, the surface warming until currents grow restless, and carry warmth into depths that remember centuries, and the sea returns it later as weather with a different accent, a slow reply that papers over the noise of short tempers. Could it be that this is what engineering looks like in time? Storage and release, delay as kindness, inertia as safety. Maybe, maybe not, and still the data hums the same low tune, signals smoothed by mass, peaks softened by distance, shocks turned into seasons. We sit with forests that learned to manage fire before names existed, undergrowth kept lean by frequent, modest burns, fuels turned to ash that feeds the next green, and in that rhythm the big fires stay rare. Only when silence stretches too long does the loop become brittle, and then flame returns as a shout instead of a sentence, and we realize that patience is not delay alone, but measured repetition, small losses traded for a longer peace. We lean over a salt marsh, as it edits the height of the tide, grasses holding sediment, where water slows, mud lifting the plain in step with sea level, and the feedback reads like a lullaby. More flood brings more silt raises the bed, a near balance that endures until the rise outruns the gift, and even then the marsh retreats with grace, seeding itself upslope where space remains. Perhaps grace is only feedback with room. We turn to the atmosphere, to clouds practicing their double work, cooling by day when they are high and thin, warming by night when they are low and thick, and the system composes warmth with shade, and shade with warmth, a duet that errs but does not quit, and our fear softens just enough to let us measure properly. Because measurement is the form, humility takes when awe needs a handle. We watch a mountain build its own weather, air climbing, cooling, shedding rain that feeds the river, that carves the valley, that lowers the weight, that slows the uplift, that changes the rain again, and the loop is a soft engine, erosion paying down elevation like a mortgage over epochs, not because the mountain surrenders, but because persistence is happier than height. We stand by a river where a levee was set back and the floodplain reintroduced to its job, water spreading thin as it peaks, sediments dropping like heavy thoughts, at last allowed to rest, and the next flood arrives kinder for having learned the path. We hear in this the word tuning, not tuning to perfection, but to tolerance, to a range within which life can improvise. We open a stalagmite and trace a seesaw of wet and dry in oxygen's ratio, monsoon breathing in and out for thousands of years, strengthened by heat difference, weakened when seas and land grow similar, and the cave keeps time with drips that thicken in generous years and thin in years of distance. And we imagine the loop as a dancer rather than a clock, responsive, graceful when unforced, clumsy when pushed hard. Is it possible that feedbacks are the planet's form of attention, the way systems remember their past long enough to steer their next step? Soil moisture modulating storms by feeding evaporation, deserts sending dust to seas that bloom and draw down carbon, volcanoes exhaling CO2 that warms enough to wake the rain, that accelerates weathering, that locks carbon back into rock, a loop that runs on stone patience, measured in millions, far beyond the tick of our cities. We listen to subduction again, the longest edit we can touch, plates sliding under, water easing melting, arcs lifting mountains that feed rivers that bury carbon, that rides back down, and outgassing and drawdown speak in a dialect of centuries and millennia, that refuses panic without denying change. Perhaps this is why deep time calms us, not because it excuses, but because it demonstrates function that does not require our urgency to be real. We kneel in a prairie, remade by small grazers and frequent fire, roots deep as memory, carbon held in the dark where air visits rarely, and the loop is plain enough to sketch with a stick. Bite prompts growth, growth feeds soil, soil feeds rain, rain feeds grass, and nothing is hoarded except resilience, which accumulates quietly as depth. Maybe feedback is the planet's ethics: no brag, no waste, no brittle edges, and engineering, when done gently, is the art of adding a loop without breaking the ones we inherited. Shade a stream to cool its fish, and the fishes return shades. Eggs in turn, plant a belt of trees to slow the wind, and the calmer field returns moisture that softens the next gust. Small circles that strengthen themselves without asking for applause. We sit with numbers because loops are easiest to love when counted. Albedo curves that show snow's swift help and quicker exit under a bleak sun. Heat capacity charts that explain why seas regulate tantrums. Isotope stacks that reveal cycles we misremember as trends, and our faith relocates from hope to habit, from wanting to watching, from demand to maintenance. And this is the kind of trust we can hand to a child without lying. We glance at our layer in the record, and hear where we have pressed loops beyond their comfort. Greenhouse gases rising faster than oceans can absorb without souring. Forests cut until fires speak too loudly. Rivers straightened until floods cease to learn patience. And feedbacks answer with more of what we make. Warming begetting more warming, as ice retires. Dryness, recruiting more dryness as soil crusts. And the lesson lands gently but firmly. Add loops that damp, remove loops that amplify harm, and do it with the slowness of systems, not the speed of markets. Could it be that patience is not waiting but pacing, moving at a rate that lets partners keep up, oceans with air, soils with rain, coasts with storm, because synchronization is the softest strength? Maybe not, and yet everywhere we look, the durable designs hold a beat that life can learn, and life has never failed to learn, a beat that does not hurry it to death. Night settles in a basin that once held a lake, and will again. Cool air, sliding down slopes like a river of shade, pools fogging at their edges, crickets measuring the temperature with their legs, and we feel the planet's metronome, without needing to name it. A tick we can't hear but can match, if we agree to be quieter than our wants. And yet, if patience is an instrument, and feedback is the hand that plays it, what would it mean to tune ourselves to this time? What story do we tell that moves as slowly as stone, and as lightly as air? And where in that slow telling does the human layer become a question mark, that helps instead of a full stop that ends? If the human layer is to become a question mark that helps, it might begin with the way we slow our sentences until they match the ground, the way we let maps be invitations instead of orders, and we breathe into that idea like air, entering a cool cave, careful not to wake the echoes too fast, careful to feel where stone wants to hold, and where it wants to yield, not because surrender is virtue, but because fit is kinder than force. We stand on a riverbank at dusk, where engineers and willow cuttings share a plan, setback levees, giving room for the flood to spread thin, side channels carved only where the old channels once were, large wood anchored like punctuation that teaches water to pause, and the numbers downstream grow humbler, peaks lower, turbidity easing, soils accepting what once tore past. And in this a question mark takes shape. What if we let rivers remember, and then we learned from their remembering? We walk a city street that found shade again, basalt dark roofs coated pale, vines writing slow sentences up facades, courtyards, unpaved, so rain can speak to soil, and evening comes more gently now, temperatures falling as if gravity had returned to heat. and the air smells like a place that has agreed to be lived in. Maybe identity for a city is not its skyline, but its night, how softly it releases the day, how easily its materials forget heat, how willingly its pavements leave space for roots to keep the ledger of moisture and cool, and the isotope trail of urban rain begins to lean back toward the countryside's balance. We step out to a coastline, where houses stepped back and dunes were stitched with grass instead of concrete, where marshes returned as translators between storm and street, and the surge arrives like a guest who knows where to put its coat, the wave energy spent in leaves and stems, and meanders before the doorstep hears its soft hand, not because storms grew kinder, but because we lowered our voice, and the landscape answered in kind, a feedback we could feel in our ribs, slower repairs, fewer scars, memories stored in sediment, rather than debt. Could it be that the truest technology now is attention arranged into habitat, sensor buoys, sharing wind with albatross, satellites, watching the green breath of plankton, so fishes and reefs can rest, small weirs letting aquifers sip floodwater while keeping fish unbroken, and all of it running on the same power as a tide, timing, patience, repetition, maybe, maybe not. And yet the graphs bend where this kind of engineering enters the room. Carbon leaning less steeply, nitrogen calming in estuaries, migratory corridors, thickening with survivors, who return because the map held. We visit a forest that learned to carry fire at the old pace again, leaf litter thinned by cool burns, bark calloused by mild summers of flame, and in its rings we read an easing of crisis, narrow years widening into steady music, drought years survived with poise. And the forest's question to us grows tender. Can we keep this rhythm with you inside it? Can our feedbacks hold if your hunger rests a little? Can decay pay for growth if you stop borrowing so hard from tomorrow? We watch a landfill transformed into a hill that is not ashamed, methane drawn off and offered to stoves, slopes contoured for water to walk without running, native plants knitting roots into what was once a refusal, and fungi rehearsing their quiet theatre of return, plastic fragments yielding to sun and wind, until they are so small, the soil must learn to say no. And we learn to stop making what cannot be taught to rot. The techno-fossil thins, the alloy pebble becomes a rare punctuation, rather than a dialect, and our layer brightens less than it stabilizes.
We kneel at a field edge where hedgerows went back in, where insects found the runway to orchards that had forgotten their language, and the yield steadies not because magic returned, but because translation did. Wind slowed, dew lingered, birds stitched holes in hunger, and the chemistry of the soil grew less lonely. Carbon tucked in clay, nitrogen traveling with gentler companions, isotopes leaning toward the music of places that keep more than they spend, and the ledger of care adds up to something a child could draw without numbers. Is it possible that our best identity in the record is restraint, the thin line where errors are corrected faster than they are made, where we become a species that remembers how to exit, that leaves continuity instead of noise, that learns to disappear into functions that outlive us, not because we deny ourselves, but because we grew tired of being louder than our welcome, and the welcome was always what we wanted. We sit with deep time the way one sits with a grandparent who has no need to win, and we ask what story moves as slowly as stone and as lightly as air, and the answer arrives like cool seep through rock. Tell it with measurements and with moss, with patience and with praise. Plan in decades, but think in centuries. Turn ambition into maintenance. Make the beautiful reversible, and prefer systems that repair themselves after we stop clapping. We turn to loss with a softer face, knowing some habitats will not return in the climates we have set, and our question mark helps by bending. Where will the new marshes be when seas have walked inland? Where will the forests migrate as heat changes their grammar? Where can corridors be laid now? So a century later the movement looks like memory rather than flight, and in asking early we make room for grace to arrive on time. We stand at a quarry that has finished its sentence and see it filled from the bottom up, layers of clean rubble for water to write in, soils lifted in thin applause for roots, cliffs left for swallows to lace, and the cold, clear pool at the bottom becomes a way station for rain on its long walk to the aquifer. and in this small new lake we hear a lesson we wish we had learned sooner. Give voids a job, give scars a purpose, give endings a next use. We return to the shoreline at night, stars red in fragments where clouds drift, the horizon breathing in a long, slow tide, and we feel how small design can be when the planet's large designs are flowing, and the relief is deep. Our task is no longer to hold back an ocean, only to help a marsh remember, to help a river keep its manners, to help a city release heat like a field releases doubt, and that is work we can do without breaking ourselves. Maybe our footprint will be a soft pressure instead of a bruise, the slight lean of ratios toward calm, the modest tilt of nitrogen toward soil, the habit of planting shade where ice used to do the job, the patience to time a burn before a summer turns loud, the willingness to move back from edges that cannot hold us. Maybe our monuments will be measurements that show a curve easing toward balance, a graph that looks like a hand held out and then released. The night deepens, and our breath settles into the metronome of crickets and distant water, and somewhere a basalt shoulder still radiates the last of a day it learned to carry, cooling into usefulness, into sleep, into a morning that will need less of us, because we have learned to need less of it. And yet, if a question mark can guide rather than command, if we can be the hinge that opens space instead of the bolt that locks it, what message would we leave for the far future that is gentle, durable, and clear? What pattern buried with care could help someone we will never meet find their way back to balance? If a message must be gentle, durable, and clear, perhaps it should be made of ratios and rhythms more than words, placed where stone already keeps its promises, and we imagine a record that needs no alphabet, ceramic plates etched with spirals of seasons, buried in laws where dust arrives like time itself, their grooves encoding warm and cold like a slow heartbeat, a map someone could play with light, not because we distrust language, but because geology already speaks in patterns, and patterns outlive tongues. We picture alloys chosen to weather into kindness, glass that becomes sand without poison, pigments locked inside stable minerals that won't bleed into water, and the message written as behavior, a landscape restored to its grammar, marsh at the foot of a city, forests thin to carry cool fire, rivers rejoined to their floodplains, so that whoever reads us in the strata understands not only what we knew, but how we moved when we learned it. And the isotope trails of carbon and nitrogen lean back toward patience like a note pinned softly to the air. Maybe the clearest signal is a modulation rather than a mark, a slow easing in the carbon curve, a lull in soot, a narrowing of heavy metals in estuary mud, shells growing thicker as acidity relaxes, tree rings widening where shade returned to cities, groundwater rising where fields learn to drink rain again. And the future scholar will not need our names to see a species turning its appetite into maintenance. Could it be that legacy is just a change in tempo that helps the chorus find its key? We sit with deep time and consider where to place our hints in stalagmites that will grow over ceramic seeds inscribed with scales and calendars, in arid basins where salt remembers every storm, in lacquer-string clays that stack their summers like paper, in basalt caverns where magnetism will hold direction long after our compasses are myths, and each placement respects entropy as a collaborator, buried from oxygen, cooled from haste, sheltered by habit, offered to subduction only after copies have walked upslope in the bones of museums the size of hills. We think of self-erasure, not as vanishing but as editing, leaving instructions that remain when we are gone. Plant on contour, burn before the summer grows loud, let rivers keep their braids, give dunes room, give coasts corridors, build roofs that forget heat by night, choose materials that decline into soil, and write these procedures into the land itself, so the manual reads as function rather than rule, as wetland rather than warning sign, as shade rather than sermon, and any creature with a body will recognize the kindness. Is it possible that the most durable clarity is a chorus of small repeating forms branching planted where flow must divide, hexagonal pavements that crack without shattering, ripples restored where movement meets boundary, so that even if our artifacts fade, the design language we chose will persist as repaired rivers and softened hills, as reefs that breathe because acidity was allowed to fall, as prairies that keep carbon in roots deeper than memory. Maybe the proof of care is the way places continue without us. We imagine leaving a thin band of ceramic marbles in an anoxic lake, each sphere a different density, settling in a gradient that encodes a simple constant, a universal ratio, a kindness to any mind that counts, and above them a living layer speaks the same numbers in shells and cellulose, so that translation can happen without teachers, because instruction is woven into what grows there. We lay a quiet path for seekers we will never meet, boreholes capped with symbols that mirror constellations, not to warn but to align, so that any sky can orient the reader on any ground. Repositories marked not by threat but by gardens that persist without irrigation, a proof by continuity that what rests below is sealed as well as a seed, and the only message necessary is the health of the place that sits on top. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we cannot choose how we are read, and yet we can choose how we write, slower, softer, with more room for correction, so that any misreading does little harm, and the strong reading is simply this: they learn to belong. We press a small plaque of fired clay into the back wall of a cave where dripstone will inherit it, etched not with kings or years but with a tide chart, and an almanac of birds, with the ratio of oxygen isotopes that marks warm rain and cold, with the simple instruction to test and test again before believing, and the rest of the cave will nod in stalactite and in flowstone, agreeing in its own handwriting. We spend our last metallurgy on bell tones that carry across water without frightening, on markers that sing when wind reaches a certain speed, on bridges that hum at a frequency that invites crossing, but refuses overload, so that utility becomes music and failure announces itself before it is fatal. And perhaps this, more than monuments, will be what remains: instruments tuned to safety, systems that prefer to heal. We leave a final hint in the soil itself, biochar in modest amounts, not as a boast but as a habit, black in the furrows like a punctuation that soils love, raising cash in exchange, holding water through lean months, feeding fungi the scaffold they need, and centuries later the dark will still be there, gentle as a memory, telling any reader with roots how to survive a season that refuses rain. Night unrolls, and the cool comes, and our breath matches the land as it loses its heat in confidence, and we feel how little must be said when performance carries meaning: wetland filtering, forest shading, reef knitting, river braiding, city releasing, field storing, the verbs working without audience. And yet, if we can leave a pattern more than a plaque, a tempo more than a text, what of the dream that a planet could remember itself through us as well as without us? What would it feel like to be read, to be held in the cycles we restored, and how do we carry that humility into the last chapters where silence begins to sound like an answer? If a planet could remember itself through us as well as without us, perhaps it would feel like being read with care, like a hand passing over a page of stone not to claim it, but to learn its texture, and we let that feeling settle as night settles on a plain that used to be a sea. Warm rock giving back its day in a long even sigh, stars forming in pools where water keeps a quiet mirror, not because the world needs our attention, but because attention when gentle becomes part of the record. We walk along a strand line fossilized in a hillside, and imagine the tide on the day it drew that clean, deliberate mark, and somewhere in the muscle of our legs, the rhythm matches, calf to crest, heel to foam, and the shared cadence feels like recognition. Could it be that perception is the body's way of entering geology, that our pulse is a door through which deep time speaks in units we can keep? We kneel at a thin band of ash and hear the volcano's memory pass through our breath, sulfur faint as a word on the tongue, trace metals speaking low, and the sympathy is not sentimental, it is measured isotopes that map the ash to the mountain, shards that point to the direction of wind, grains that fix the hour when light dimmed and leaves held their breath, and by placing ourselves inside that chain of evidence we become
briefly, a conduit through which the last remains of a day communicate with the present. Maybe this is what it means to be read by a planet, to be used for sense. We sit with a skeleton turned to stone, vertebrae repeating like beads, each ring a calculus of growth and hunger, and by tracing the curve we recall a motion that ended before us, and continues now in the arc of our spine, leaning forward. In that small echo identity feels shared, not stolen, and our humility grows real enough to touch, not because we are small though we are, but because we are continuous with what came before, a late phrase in a language fluent in erosion and repair. We follow a river in darkness by its sound, a braided hush that separates and reunites, and the mind finds form in the noise the way it finds constellations in a sky. But tonight the forms are not inventions, they are gradients under our fingertips, coolness rising from channels, warmth lingering on bars, damp air brushing our shins where a side stream slips back, and we think, is it possible that care is just good, listening practiced long enough to become instinct, that the planet is read most truly by knees and knuckles, by noses and lungs, by the willingness to stand still so information can arrive. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe the world reads us back when we move at its pace, when we test without haste, when we return to the same rock until its quiet becomes articulate, when our ratios improve not because we guessed but because we stayed, and staying writes a softer signature into air and water, less soot, calmer nitrogen, carbon leaning toward root and shell, and the improvement is its own inscription, a thin, bright confidence in the strata that says we were teachable. We lie on warm basalt and watch satellites overrun old stars, and the contrast aches and then eases, because the sky has always been crowded with crossings we could not see, meteors, microbes, winds that travel continents, and our brief constellations will fall as others did, and the record of them will be glassy sand resorted by waves, and we decide that being read gently means engineering our artifacts to decline, into uses the land recognizes, ash into soil, metal into stones that do not taint the tide, concrete into gravel that remembers how to drain. We turn toward the notion of self-erasure not as an apology, but as a craft, like a painter choosing pigments that will age into earth tones rather than shout forever. And we write procedures instead of monuments, burn schedules etched into contour, floodways planted rather than paved, roofs that pulse heat out at dusk, culverts sized to the memory of storms rather than the rumor of budgets. And these choices keep working without us, and that is how a message becomes a habitat. We listen to the old feedbacks breathe, ice learning when to brighten and when to withdraw, deserts sending iron to seas, volcanoes offering carbon that rain will take back to rock, and we place our lives between those breaths, like notes that do not insist on being heard alone. What if belonging is just choosing tempos that do not trip the larger rhythms, choosing appetites that do not starve the future, choosing materials that do not argue with decay? We walk a quarry, reclaimed by patience, terraces softened with moss, a cold blue pool stitched with reeds, swallows sowing evening into cliff and air, and we feel the planet reading us kindly because we have left it something legible, gradients restored, edges made porous, water invited to think in meanders again, and that legibility is a form of trust we can feel in our ribs, steady, low like thunder too far away to frighten. We pass through a grove where biochar darkens the soil in a modest grammar, cash and exchange high enough to hold rain in August, fungi carrying phosphorus along threads of agreeing shade, and the only text here is health that does not require attention, a paragraph of roots written into depth rather than spread, and the future will read this as a faint carbon bias that speaks of restraint rather than absence, of participation rather than control. We stand again at the edge of the old sea that became a plain, and the wind sets a traveling ripple across grass that once was chalk and will be soil, and will be rock again, and for a moment the ripple is inside us, a wave of breath that rolls down the back and returns slow, and the sensation is not grand, only correct, and correctness is a kind of beauty we too rarely praise. Perhaps being read by a planet means letting correctness be enough. We ask softly, what sign could we leave for someone far ahead that would teach without harm? And the answers are all verbs: filter, shade, braid, loosen, slow, test, return. And verbs are easy to keep if they are practiced, and impossible if they are engraved. So we choose practice. We choose places that will remember even when paper forgets. And we let the memory live in how the valley behaves, how the coast absorbs, how the city releases, how the field stores, and not in how loudly we claim we cared. The night grows more intricate and less bright, and our eyes adjust to the honesty of lower light, to the fullness of sound, when no one is performing, and we understand that silence is not emptiness, but capacity, the room in which the next kindness can fit, the pause that lets a system regain its balance, and we carry that into the mouth of sleep like a shell that still smells faintly of salt and sun. And yet, if the world can read us by the improvements we leave in its breath and bones, if our best lines are those we write into cycles instead of stone, what language will we need tomorrow, when the human layer drifts into a question mark of its own? How do we speak of ourselves as guests, and how do we listen for the house we are still learning to keep? If speaking as guests requires a different language, it might begin with softer verbs and longer silences, with sentences that follow water instead of roads, and we let our voices lower to the pitch of soil, breathing after rain, to the pace of a shadow crossing a field at evening, because the house we are learning to keep was here before we named it, and will be here after our syllables, weather back to dust, not because we are unimportant, but because importance grows quieter when it learns to last. We practice introductions with our hands, not our signs, palms on bark, to feel the flow of sap, fingertips on stone, to hear the chalky memory of sea, bare feet on floodplain silt, to remember how forgiveness feels when rivers forget their banks, and the body learns a grammar that speaks in pressure and release, in give and take, in the modest mathematics of balance that erosion and growth keep across disagreements. We try new pronouns for place, not as worship but as accuracy, calling wetland us, when we stand inside its cooling, calling glacier we, when our thirst descends from its patient cold, calling basalt home when its minerals sit like old tools in our blood, and the intimacy feels less like a metaphor, and more like a ledger checked at dusk. Could it be that humility is simply noticing how much of ourselves is borrowed, and how much of what we borrow prefers to be returned on time? We practice reading the quiet in the room, the old drafts that move downhill. When evening comes, the way moths turn when a heat island rises, the low exhale of a bog that keeps its carbon like a secret without scolding, and the language of the house turns out to be procedural, open here, close there, pause at noon, move at dawn, let decay pay, let shade decide, let water choose the path of least regret. And in learning these verbs, we notice how many of our nouns become unnecessary. Maybe, maybe not, maybe this is only a lullaby we sing to make the night kinder. And yet the measures nod, yes, when the song is tuned, temperatures fall, where trees re-enter cities, floods grow slower, where fields learn to drink, coasts breathe when dunes repair the broken punctuation, and isotopes lean toward calmer stories in shells and rings, and cave drips that grow thicker when patience returns. We check our impulse to declare and replace it with a habit to test, not because doubt is fashionable, but because truth is shy, and numbers are patient, and we become guests by handling time, the way a visitor handles a family heirloom, with both hands, at the table, in good light, and never while hurrying. We test and test again, until the pattern reveals a path that we can walk without apology, a way to move heat, store water, share edges, and leave enough pause for breath. We ask quieter questions that keep openings instead of endings. What if roads branched like roots, and carried rain, instead of fear? What if farms layered like forests and fed soils first? What if cities learned to forget heat each night, as rivers forget anger, after a floodplain holds them? And what if our calendars followed migrations we do not control, letting work rest when storms must pass, and resuming when the house has finished its correction? We speak to extinction with the voice one uses at a hospital window, not loud, not resigned, attentive to small turns for the better, aware of pain, holding gratitude for each return. Fern spikes after fires, coral polyps after long heat, seedlings in charcoal, wolves after long absence, and our language becomes a ledger of little victories, rather than a theatre of defeat, because the house prefers repairs to narratives, and so do we. When we are honest, we learn to apologize in geology, not in headlines. Biochar, folded into clay where fields were starving, hedgerows stitched across bare windmills, culverts widened to match a storm's remembered width, and the apology is accepted when the ratios settle, oxygen in water sweetening nitrogen losing its edge, carbon resting below where air can no longer tempt it, and the proof lives in larks and minnows, and a summer that sleeps cool enough for roofs to let go at night. We begin to measure generosity instead of growth alone, mapping corridors where motion can stay wild, counting the days a river spends outside its cage without harm, weighting our pride by the ease with which a wetland can say, I can handle this. When a storm knocks, is it possible that success for a guest species is not leaving no trace, but leaving the kind of trace that holds doors open? A habit that future rain can recognize as hospitality. We teach children the names of rocks, the way we teach relatives names, and the rocks answer with patience, granite for endurance, schist for pressure that does not complain, limestone for the long soft work of tiny lives, stacked into cliffs that will one day be soil. And in these introductions identity loosens into place self again, warm and ordinary, less heroic, and more reliable. Like a hand that knows where the spoons are kept without asking. We learn silence, that isn't absence, hour-long, tide-long, season-long quiets, where data collects, and the world shows its intentions without commentary, and we become the kind of listeners who can change course with grace, when the measures contradict our hopes, not because hope is useless, but because hope kept honest, by record becomes trust. And trust is what a house needs from its guests. We borrow our metaphors from processes that forgive, braiding instead of forcing, shading instead of cooling, settling instead of squeezing, and our speech grows less like orders and more like weather advisories, read to a friend, gentle, precise, timely, leaving room to improvise, always spoken in the calmest voice in the room, because panic does not partner well with geology. We hold our desire to be remembered and choose, when we can, to be legible, instead, a thin bias in shells that says the water was kinder that year, a slight thickening of peat, where fire was given back its cool pace, a calmer carbon story in tree rings, where pavement gave way to loam, and somewhere a future hand will trace these changes, and feel recognized by us, without knowing our letters. We turn out the lights earlier, and watch the shape of the house return, the night insects mapping their soft economies, bats editing mosquitoes without instruction, dew condensing on unsealed ground, while roofs release heat in long whispers, and the system feels listened to, not commanded, and there is relief in that, like finding a rhythm you don't have to carry alone. We end this lesson without closing it, letting the last sentence drift like mist over a floodplain that just took a deep breath and laid it down as water. And we ask a question that does not need an answer tonight. If we can learn to be guests in a house that keeps our names in water and stone, what else might we remember in our sleep? What has the planet been repeating so gently that we only hear it when everything is quiet enough to be true? If the planet has been repeating something so gently that we only hear it when everything is quiet enough to be true, perhaps it is the way becoming never stops. The way form is a verb, and not a verdict, and we lie with that understanding the way one lies beside a slow river at night, counting the small sounds, an eddy turning, a reed letting go, a fish writing a brief silver sentence, and each sound says the same soft thing in a different accent. Keep going, but go slowly.
We feel deep time move under our ribs like a tide that knows no shore, and it makes grief easier to carry without shrinking it, because loss is part of the grammar that lets return have meaning. Fossils tell us this each time a shell becomes stone without losing its curve, each time a fern's shadow takes root in shale, Each time an ammonite completes a spiral in a material that never once drew breath, and in those substitutions identity keeps walking even when memory sits down, and we understand why erosion reads like editing when we are calm enough to read to the end of the page. We turn our ear to entropy and hear no malice, only the long, patient preference for ease, and in that preference life finds work it can do, turning gradients into woven stability, bleeding heat in ways that leave shelter behind, using decay as currency, not as threat, and all the while geology keeps its slow counsel, subduction teaching how to fold a past into fuel for a future, volcanism teaching how to speak again after silence, isotopes teaching how to count without arguing, ice teaching how to say no by brightening, water teaching how to say yes by finding a path that hurts least. Maybe this is the lesson the planet repeats until even stone knows it, not because a maker willed it, but because laws stretched across eons begin to behave like care, and care, when it is old enough, does not announce itself. It simply arrives where it is needed, and leaves when it has done enough. We imagine forgotten epochs not as blanks, but as rooms where the furniture was rearranged while we were asleep, climates leaning warm, then cold, sea levels writing new margins as hands write new chapters, and each shift carried a memory forward by changing its form. Chalk seas becoming cliffs that become sand, that becomes glass, and then again sand. Forests becoming coal, that becomes heat, that becomes air, that becomes rain, that becomes root, and in these turns we hear a reassurance that meaning can change clothes without losing its face. We watch the atmosphere dim and brighten by fractions we can measure and barely feel, yet those fractions guide storms and seasons and corridors, where animals pass to become themselves in motion, and the air remembers us with unusual clarity, our soot crisp in ice, our carbon light in rings, our metals thin and bright in river mouths, and we answer that memory best by aligning our pulse to the slower beats that keep water sweet and soil ready. Could it be that our truest agency is consenting to the tempos that hold us, not because surrender is noble, but because the alternative is noise? Maybe not. Maybe we ask this because we are tired of carrying a speed that doesn't belong to our wrists, and the cave answers in drips that we can count, the marsh answers in clarity that we can see, the reef answers in return that we can name polyp by polyp, when acidity eases, and the mountain answers by growing less quickly, where forests hold its rain, and give it back the way patience gives back air to a crowded room. We practice hearing this without asking for proof that feels like a spotlight. We become content with proofs that feel like dew, quiet, spread evenly, gone by noon because they did their work at dawn, and we take on the habits that leave such proofs behind, roofs that forget heat each night, fields that hold their water without being told twice, streets that accept shade as policy rather than decoration, culverts that remember what the creek was like before we forgot its name. We hold a piece of basalt that points to a north that has moved and smile at our own insistence on directions that refuse to stay, and the rock is patient with us, as rocks are, teaching again the lesson of alignment. Face what the field offers and keep your iron steady while it changes. Let your joints crack into fairness rather than chaos. Let your weathering borrow oxygen's calm, and when you are soil, be generous. We imagine the planet's memory as a braid of chemistries and shapes and flows, and our part in the braid as a color that fades if we pull too hard, a bright thread that looks best where it shares, and this image loosens the fist around our plans. We make them anyway, but we make them like nests, adductions that hold, then release, then hold again, so the next occupant finds use without inheritance that harms. We think of identity one last time before sleep folds the room in gentler edges. It is not a trophy, it is a habit practiced across losses, a way curves recur and functions return, a willingness to be read by shells and rings and sediments we will never see, and to answer with verbs that do not need our names to keep working. The wind walks the ridge and unrolls a sound like paper, and the valley below answers by lifting a coolness that refuses to hurry, and our breath aligns as if remembering a line from a song we knew as children, but never learn to sing loudly, and we are grateful that some songs prefer to be sung under the breath. And yet, if the lesson has always been the same cadence, ease return, allow repair, what mystery waits when the cadence meets the blank again, when an extinction curtain falls, or a climate leans too far, and the room goes quiet? What begins in the instant after erasure, and what small lawful kindness is first to arrive? If the first kindness after erasure must be small and lawful, it might be the way light still finds dust, the way microbes wake where warmth returns, the way water, even thin and uncertain, stitches itself along a crack and begins again, and we imagine that hush, the curtain down, the stage smoky, the air tasting of ash or salt or cold, and then a whisper of chemistry takes a step, not because hope is brave, but because gradients invite motion, and motion is what matter remembers best. We picture a shore after a long winter of dimness, ice pulling back like a thoughtful tide, and in the new brightness diatoms rise with their tiny glass houses, delicate as breath on a mirror, fixing carbon one photon at a time, turning the sky's apology into sugar. Could it be that recovery begins with the smallest appetites, the ones that ask for almost nothing? Silica, a trace of iron, clear water, and answer with oxygen that loosens every room. We walk a forest floor where the crown has opened to weather, trunks charcoaled into quiet pillars, and under the black a chemistry warms fungal threads exploring ember-cool soil, bacteria swapping genes like lanterns in a sleepover, seeds that needed heat to crack their shells unscrolling rootlets that find ash sweet. And in this close economy decay pays for growth so cleanly that grief becomes a nutrient, not because loss is good, it is not, but because systems trained by deep time have learned to borrow against endings with care. We think of oceans after the heavy breath of anoxia, when currents begin to move again, and the boundary between light and dark loosens. The first to return are often small, coccolithophores shedding chalk that will become cliffs, foraminifera building rooms the width of a hair, zooplankton, grazing the new green with mouths like silver commas, and the sentence begins to write itself across the water, plankton to fish, fish to larger fish, bones to bottom, and the bottom stores the memory as fine carbonate that will outlast almost everything else. Maybe, maybe not, maybe we romance beginnings because they spare us the scale of loss, and still the numbers agree with modesty. Nitrogen in streams tapering after fire, as plants re-enter the ledger, oxygen in lakes finding dawn again, after nights of thinness, isotope trails leaning back toward prior rhythms, when dust crosses oceans to spark blooms, and the graphs do not sing, they hum, and humming is what life does when it is too busy to be dramatic. We consider continental wounds that invite fresh water, craters that become lakes, lakes that teach patience to shorelines, valves stacking in summer-winter grammar that even glaciers respect. Fish evolve in these bowls, birds write migration into the map, and sediment, unhurried, records the improvisation in bands thin as eyelashes, and we learn where to look for the first soft handwriting after catastrophe, where water slows, where light is thin but honest, where new edges make microclimates willing to lend. We follow subduction's long forgiveness, the way trenches swallow ruins and return them, years later and far away, as rain coaxed from volcanic breath, as basalt that will weather into soils ready for roots, as islands that animals will find, because the wind insists, and we allow ourselves one wonder: is it possible that the planet prefers to reuse, that the first kindness is recycling, performed without audience? Entropy's drift turned into a loop where loss is edited into continuity. We kneel by a cave drip that resumes after drought, calcite, adding its patient syllable to a column interrupted for decades, and the oxygen there carries the news, warmer, then cooler, then warmer again, and the drip's steadiness feels like a hand on the back that does not push, only steadies, and we understand how recovery can be quieter than survival, how it moves in increments too small for triumph, and just right for time. We step into a salt flat, after rare rain, and watch a thin skin wrinkle itself into polygons as it dries, each edge a negotiation with evaporation, each corner a pact among crystals,
and beneath the skin brine shrimp hatch by the millions, living a lifetime while the window is open, eggs returning to sleep before the heat recovers its rule, and the choreography is precise, not because urgency is wise, but because urgency learned its limits. We imagine a coastline rethreading its fabric, dunes catching wind-blown seed where fences once stood, cordgrass setting a net that slows a tide's impatience, oysters soldering themselves into reefs that break waves into lace, and soon the estuary breathes in two directions again, salt meeting fresh with manners, and the nursery returns without fanfare, because the first kindness is almost always an invitation rather than a decree. We press our ear to basalt warmed by a thin sun, and hear nothing, only feel the day leaving evenly, and that evenness is instruction. Lose heat gently, avoid shocks, favor columns over shards, and when the iron inside points to a north that will drift, agree to point again when you cool the next time. Identity in this view is readiness to align, and alignment is how matter says yes to becoming without breaking what recovers it. We sit with fossils that form in catastrophe's wake, logjams turned to stone, rapid burials that preserve fins and feathers, and the tenderness of posture, and in those quick careful petrifications, we hear time urging us to keep our attention, because after erasure the window of clarity can be brief, and the record prefers readers who arrive without a story to prove. Is it possible that the planet's memory is most teachable at these margins, just after the fall, just before the surge, when feedbacks begin to assemble, and the first loops close, that the most useful questions then are the small ones? Where does water pause? Where does shade persist? Where do ratios lean toward comfort? And the answers are locations, not declarations, found with knees and notebooks and the discipline to return. The night grows colder over a plain that used to be seabed, and dew collects in old ripple marks, a microclimate inside a fossil, condensation inside a memory, and we feel the whole instruction resting in that tiny kindness, cool enough to hold, rough enough to keep, quiet enough to share, and the air smells faintly of salts that learn to lose without bitterness. And yet, if the first arrivals after silence are always the small, the procedural, the lawful, light, dust, drip, bloom, what greater pattern do they signal from afar? What blueprint waits in their caution for us to trace with wider hands without tearing it? And how do we hold that pattern long enough to become its students rather than its interruption? If a blueprint waits inside those careful beginnings, it might look like a braid more than a plan, a set of rules that stay soft at the edges, spread load, share flow, leave room, and we trace it with our hands the way one traces the grain of wood, learning by touch how not to splinter what was meant to bend. We notice how rivers divide to slow themselves, how roots branch to meet water without stealing it, how dunes ripple to pass wind along instead of stopping it, and the braid holds because each strand yields a little, not because yielding is noble, but because it keeps the whole from snapping when weather tests its patience. We watch layers gather like quiet decisions, thin beds of silt stacked after floods, valves in lakes counting summers and winters like thumbprints, forest floors building a dark memory in crumbs, and we begin to see that time prefers thickness to height, redundancy to spectacle, complexity built from reversible moves. Could it be that the blueprint is a repertoire of small permissions, open when warm, close when cold, settle where speed drops, rise where light deepens, rest when ratios tilt, and resume when they soften? We stand inside a wetland and feel the braid at work, edge after edge, multiplying until water can't find a single path to anger, microbes catching nitrogen in a web no eye can see, reeds stitching oxygen into mud as if writing love letters to roots, and the place reads as instruction more than scene, filter by fractal, store by sponge, release by seep, invite by shade, and the lesson travels well, ready to be spoken wherever gravity writes in cursive. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe blueprints are illusions we draw to comfort our need for guidance, and still the physics repeats itself across scales, hexagons, where cooling wants fairness, branching where flow meets distance, ripples where movement brushes boundary, spirals where growth adds without changing shape, and these patterns solve quietly and everywhere, like good manners in a room full of strangers. We take this braid to coasts and watch dunes hold wind's memory in place. Grasses slowing sand until a hill learns its best version of standing, marshes catching tide and returning it cleaner, oysters soldering waves into lace, and the shoreline stops being a line and becomes a conversation, a layered yes that can absorb a no without breaking. The blueprint does not draw a wall, it composes a sentence with commas, slow here, breathe here, turn here, and even storms learn to read it when given time. We follow the braid underground, where caves write from drips, stalagmites, building columns that remember drought as thinner rings and monsoon as thick, and oxygen in calcite keeps a climate's pulse steady enough to test our stories against, and the discipline this encourages, measure before myth, patiently belongs to the blueprint too, because a plan that survives erosion must accept correction as a form of love. We walk across basalt cooled into columns, and feel how cracks chose distance with kindness, relief distributed as geometry, and we carry that into our making, bricks that breathe, pavements that drink, roofs that forget heat by night, culverts that talk to floods in the grammar of meanders, and our layer brightens less, thickens more, reads kinder. Is it possible that the braid includes forgetting as a function, entropy as the editor that strikes what cannot be sustained, decay as the eraser that makes space for corrections, subduction as the recycling that returns old text as new margins, and that wisdom is knowing when to let the page clear? Fossils agree by their very existence, their identities traded into minerals that hold the curve and let the body go. We imagine forgotten epochs as drafts in the braid, warmth rehearsed and cooled again, oxygen rising then leveling, continents drifting into new chords, and each draft keeps a few lines that worked, branching rivers and lungs, hexagonal fairness in stone and hive, spiraled economies in shells and galaxies, and in this continuity we find permission to borrow forms that proved themselves, not as decoration, but as verbs, branch, ripple, layer, spiral, braid. We test the braid with isotopes, the way one tests a bridge with footsteps, oxygen in ice to hear the sway of heat, carbon in rings to feel the long reach of breath, strontium in shells to learn where waters blended, and when the measures nod in concert across cave and core and coral, we trust the pattern enough to step, to place a marsh where a marsh wants to be, to leave a floodway open where flood remembers the door, to let reefs rest while pH falls and resume when it rises, our schedule tuned to feedback instead of fear. We kneel at a terrace where river and field met long ago, dark soil thick with the memory of roots, and we plant for slowness, contour lines catching rain, hedges teaching wind to walk, biochar keeping summer from forgetting spring, and the field learns again to say yes in drought and yes in flood, not loudly, but with the steady grammar that feeds more than the season. We hold a shard of pottery found in a paleosol, and think of messages that chose to be useful, clays that refused to poison the water as they fell back to earth, glazes that weathered into minerals plants could greet, pigments that declined into soils without scarring, and we decide that artifacts are pages in the braid, only when they help the braid hold, and the rest is noise, the editor will remove. We lay the blueprint down beside a city, and watch it relax, alleys turned to gardens that braid pollinators through neighborhoods, streets terraced so storms step rather than run, roofs rippling like dunes to trade heat for night, and the city's isotopes begin to lean back toward countryside values, oxygen in rain less exhausted, carbon in leaves more content, nitrogen in streams less sharp, and we hear relief without applause. We look ahead to the next curtain that will fall, knowing one always does, and ask what part of the braid will matter most then. The answer arrives in small voices, seeds that wait, spores that travel, plankton that rise, drips that resume, soils that remember shade, dunes that rethread wind, reefs that rebuild procedures, not monuments, proto-plans stored in cycles that do not require permission to begin. Night deepens over a plain of old sea and young grass, and our breath follows the braid without trying, in through the nose like tide along a marsh edge, out through the mouth like wind across a dune, steady as a cave drip that has found its stone again, and the quiet asks nothing but attention. And yet, if the blueprint is indeed a braid of forms and feedbacks, soft rules that make repair inevitable, What final question remains but the tender one? Can we trust becoming to carry us if we carry it? And if so, how do we step back without stepping away, leaving room for the last silence to speak for itself? If stepping back without stepping away is possible, it might feel like holding a door while the house breathes, standing just outside the threshold where wind can turn and water can think, and we let that posture settle in our shoulders, the way dusk settles on a plain that used to be a sea, coolness sliding down from the ridge, dew rehearsing the small mercies it will leave before dawn, not because absence is noble, but because presence can be quiet enough to keep the pattern whole. We sit with deep time as if it were a patient animal, letting our hands learn its weight without gripping, and the world answers with its oldest instructions. Sediment falls where speed drops, heat leaves by night, if given dark. Oxygen rises when small lives keep their glass houses and feed the air, one photon at a time, and carbon returns to stone when rain chooses slow paths through silicate and soil. Each process so lawful, it relaxes the mind that listens. Could it be that wisdom is not adding complexity, but removing friction until the loops remember how to close? We spend an evening by a river that learned its manners again, curving across a floodplain that is now a room and not a wall, and the water's voice trims our thoughts into smaller, truer shapes. Driftwood has been set to annotate the current, reeds to soften the insistence, side channels to carry the anxiety elsewhere, and in the silt's quiet settling, we see the future writing itself in thin, readable lines, valves that will one day show a patient scholar how a valley regained its breath, how nitrogen lost its edge, how a spring arrived earlier and less angrily after shade returned. We walk a coast that has traded concrete for grammar, dunes stitched with roots, marshes rethreaded into the tide, oyster reefs soldering waves into lace, and in the give and take we feel a soft authority that does not need to raise its voice. Storms are still storms, but their sentences break into commas before they reach the door, and the house remains a house because the thresholds have been taught to absorb, not deflect. Maybe this is stepping back without stepping away, letting edges act like lungs, instead of shields. We think of fossils asleep under heather, bones traded for calcite, that holds the curvature of a life with tenderness, and we allow that tenderness to instruct our materials. Clay that weathers into soil, rather than poison, pigments that decline into minerals, the field can recognize, glass that chooses to become sand without insult, and our layer in the rock begins to read like literacy, rather than noise. A thin band of better ratios, fewer regrets, more functions that persist after names evaporate. We listen to the cave, drip the way one listens to a clock that has learned patience, oxygen in calcite, whispering wet, then dry, then wet again, and our bodies adjust to that tempo, leaving ambition out in the night air, like heat cooling from basalt columns that cracked into fairness as they lost their fire. Could it be that the most radical move is to match the lawful pace of repair, to plan in decades, think in centuries, and act in seasons, letting each action be reversible, each correction smaller than the harm it mends? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe this is only the lullaby we deserve after loud years, and yet the isotopes nod, carbon in leaves leaning toward calm, where roofs learn to forget heat by dusk, nitrogen in streams growing less sharp, where hedges knit wind and shade, oxygen in ice, finding a quieter curve, when forests recovered their edges, and numbers make a gentler kind of music, that even tired minds can trust. We imagine subduction taking our brief experiment downwards, packaging our glassy sands and alloy pebbles with diatoms and clay, sending them into warmth to be edited into minerals that do not remember us, and we are not offended by this forgetting. It feels like mercy that our heavy marks can be thinned into trace, that our boldness can be translated into rain, that feeds a forest we will never see, that our lesson, if we left one, will be stored as a bias in shells and rings, rather than a monument that insists. We spend a night on an old basalt plateau turning to soil, stars leaning into the cooled stone, our breath slowing to meet the invisible exhale of the ground, and we think of entropy again, not as erasure, but as the editor who makes room for revision, trimming where we crowded, smoothing where we snagged, and we are grateful to be part of a draft that can still improve by loss. Identity widens here. becoming place self that outlives us, a cadence that continues in reeds and dunes, and dripstone, even if our words are forgotten by noon. We speak to the next reader with verbs, instead of sentences, filter, shade, braid, loosen, pause, and the verbs show up as wetlands that work without asking, soils that compute moisture in pores. We did not cement, reefs that heal, because acidity dropped just enough in time. And we understand that messages are best delivered as procedures stored in habitat, not engraved on tablets that cannot drink. We consider atmospheric change as a biography we are still editing, and we choose lines that are easy to remove later, fuels that decay into soils, cities that can cool without machines, corridors that let migrations trail their quiet script across continents, and the sky keeps our honesty in ratios we cannot persuade. If ore needs proof, let proof be the turn of a curve toward comfort, the widening of a ring in a year that deserved it, the thickening of a shell where the sea learned to forgive. We ask, softly, whether a planetary memory can include us without centering us, and the answer arrives as a feeling more than a fact. Yes, if we are porous. Yes, if we are willing to be read as function rather than signature. Yes, if our best lines are those that make the next lines easier to write. And we rest in that answer, the way a field rests after rain. Edges glinting, insects busy with an industry that needs no witness. We carry this quiet into the last room of the house, where windows are left open for the night to pass through, and we leave no thesis on the table, only a bowl of water, where light will collect in the morning. Only a map with rivers drawn wider than roads, only a schedule that puts the tide and the burn before the meeting, and we step back, not away, listening as the house remembers how to keep itself. And yet, if this much can be learned in the dim and the slow, if patience and small lawful acts can bend a century, what else might be returning already at the edge of hearing? The almost silent recoveries, the seeds unscrolling under ash, the plankton rehearsing dawn, and what would we notice first if we promised to meet them at their pace?